Good morning and welcome to the third annual ACC NCR Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Conference. My name is Sharifa Balagoon. I am Chief Legal and Compliance Counsel at CQ Credit Union. Additionally, I co-chair the Programming Subcommittee of the ACC NCR DEI Committee. We have an amazing morning scheduled for you and are grateful that you all are here. But before we get started, we have a few housekeeping notes. Today's conference will be recorded and will be available at a later date. Comments today should not be publicized without permission, should not be construed as legal advice, and do not represent the positions of any company, firm, or chapter. Please direct your attention to a few features that will help you enjoy and participate in today's program. We want this conversation to be interactive, but it can be difficult to chime in or ask a question orally on video conference. Please place all questions in the chat box at the bottom of the screen. We will do our best to get to all of the questions. Today's program will be closed captioned. If you would like to see a running transcript of today's discussion, then please click the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and then select enable for the live transcript. If you would like to turn off the running transcript at any time, you can click live transcript and then select disable. Please be sure you are identified on the screen with your first and last name, and please add your company as well. We also suggest that you use the speaker view rather than the gallery view for today's conference. Our theme for today's conference is why DEI efforts are not yielding sufficient results and what you can do to move the needle at your organization. When brainstorming professionals we thought could address our theme, one name quickly rose to the top of the suggestions as an expert that could speak to this topic with candor and authenticity. We are thrilled to introduce our esteemed guest, Paula Edgar. Paula is CEO of PGE Consulting Group, LLC, an organizational strategy firm that provides training and education solutions at the intersection of professional development and diversity, equity, and inclusion. As an attorney, Paula practiced employment and workplace discrimination law for the New York City Commission on Human Rights, and her professional experiences include several leadership roles focused on talent development and inclusion. Paula is a highly sought after speaker and facilitator, conducting live and virtual presentations for clients across industries. Paula develops customized programming to maximize the experience for attendees, ensuring they leave informed and inspired to have a lasting impact both individually and within their organizations. Paula's areas of diversity expertise include unconscious bias, inclusive leadership, and allyship. Her professional development skill set includes personal branding, relationship building, mentor-sponsor best practices, and business development. Paula encourages all participants to engage your hustle, her business tagline, mantra, and method to elevate their professional endeavors. Paula has written for and been featured in a wide array of publications, including the New York Times, Bloomberg Law, Essence Magazine, Shondaland, and Business Insider. Paula received the Ruth Whitehead Whaley Service Award from the Association of Black Women Attorneys. She has also been recognized by the Network Journal magazine as a 40 Under 40 Achievement Awardee, a Miss JD Woman of Inspiration, and as a rising star by A Better Chance. Paula, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, Sharifa. Hello, everyone. Good morning from sunny Jamaica. I am excited to be here with all of you. Thank you so much for the invitation to have this very, very important conversation. So if any of you have seen me speak before, you know I don't like to talk at people. I like to talk with people. And so I plan to do that today. And I want us to be as interactive as possible. And I encourage you to ask questions. And so let's get started. I'm going to share my slides because I want to speak to adult learning, which means that you need to see and hear me at the same time. And so we're going to do that. In the meantime, though, it would be helpful for me just to engage. What did you do this morning? Coffee or tea? Put it in the chat. I want to see. And if you're like water, then I want to know what your trick is. So, all right. So while you're doing that, awesome. Okay. I'm a tea gal myself, and although I've been told that because I'm in Jamaica, I have to try coffee. So I'm going to do that. Oh, it's good to see some folks that I know in the chat. Awesome. All right. So we're going to be, oh, I'm on the wrong side. We're going to be talking today. Here's this one. Can you see my name? Okay. All right. There you are. We're going to be talking about accountability today. So the conference theme is about why DEI is not moving, why the needle's not moving as much as it can. And I want to talk about my personal feeling about that and really what I've seen in the work that I've done, which is that folks are not incorporating this I, right? DEI needs your I, and that I is you in terms of accountability. And so we're going to delve into that a little bit. And I want to hear your thoughts about this as I continue on. But first, Sharifa did a wonderful job of introducing me, but I like to show this picture and just tell you a little bit more about myself, just in case. My folks, the people who I interact with the most are people from the legal profession. I interact and engage with leaders for strategic and thoughtful, inclusive leadership. And that is really one of the keys to moving the needle, which we're going to get into. And all of these things are in my LinkedIn headline. And I hope that you will connect with me on LinkedIn if we're not already connected, as I think it's important for us to continue the conversation. This is not the end of our interaction with each other. We have to collaboratively get this right. So some housekeeping, you'll see that there's a QR code on the screen. At any point, you can point your phone to it. If you're on your phone, then I'm going to put something in the chat for you so you can just use that link. In order for you to engage with me. When you click on that, you'll see that it'll bring you to a website called menti.com where we're going to do interactive. I'm going to ask you some questions, and also you can give me any comments or questions that you have in addition to the chat. I'm going to be using both things in order to hear from you and for you to hear from each other. Okay. At the beginning and also at the end of this, I want to make sure you remember my thesis for today is that you are the catalyst for change. Now, oftentimes when I interact with leaders and lawyers in general, they're always saying, well, they need to do something. And I want to encourage you to understand that you are the they that we're talking about. So I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment because I want to put in the chat, like I said, the link in case you did not scan the QR code. You can click that link and it'll bring you to the exact same space. And while you're doing that, once you get there, you'll know you're in the right place because you'll see today's date and my name on another site, the one I showed you originally. Let's talk about the landscape of what we're in. So we're in 2022, we're 2 years plus into a pandemic. Yes, deep breaths for all of us. In 2020, we experienced trauma collectively as a community, a global community, as well as a national community, and obviously individually and institutionally because of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and a myriad of other things that were tragic that occurred, but then ended up being a catalyst. So many of you were thinking about DEI prior to that. But what I do know for sure, because my phone kept ringing, my emails were going off, is that people said, oh, we have to think about DEI now after having that experience. And what I want to remind you is that we are still in that experience, right? Every single day as we navigate the fact that our world as legal professionals continues to shift, we have, this, what do they call this, turnstile of talent that is going from place to place. We have people who are really understanding that due to the pandemic, they don't want to be in places that are not supporting them. DEI is not just around the diversity that we thought it was before. Oftentimes when we would say diversity, we would think about it as just race or gender or LGBTQ status, right? Some of the bigger things, but really DEI, I've always professed, is about just people, right? Because all of us are different and all of us need to be supported. And of course we can have goals, and we should, around increased diversity. And some of the work that's being done by ACC NCR is really, I think, fantastic and innovative. I was saying that before we got started, in that you are pushing everyone to really think about what their personal commitments should be and how they can navigate that within their institution. So I want to dive into that. In order for DEI to be effective, it has to be strategic and it has to be actionable. But the secret that no one wants to talk about is that DEI is hard. It's hard. It's not, if it was easy, right? I could be gallivanting off, right, on a boat someplace. It is hard. I am here in Jamaica to decompress from all of the things, right, in life that I and all of you have had to manage in the time that we've been, in these last 2 years, but just really in general, this is hard stuff. It is hard for us to invest in people and for them to leave. It is hard for us to understand that we want representation and not to see it. It is hard for us to see that people who say that they have commitment and maybe don't. All of that is traumatic and continues to make it challenging. So I want to talk about some of the things that I know that you're probably doing. Before that, I'm going to ask you to do a quick exercise. Hold on. I feel like a DJ sometimes when I'm doing this. Okay, so back to my slides. I'm going to go to what I know that you're doing, and I want to ask you a question about what you're doing. So as I was thinking about this keynote, I thought, everybody who is sort of on the path is probably doing at least one of all of these things that you see on the screen, but definitely if you are at its baseline, you're doing all 5, right? So you've identified the issue, right? We need more diversity in our profession, right? You've identified it and then you said it internally, and then you made statements about it, hopefully internally and externally. And then what do? You do what good lawyers do. You try to find out more information. We attend events, right? You come to events like this one where you can learn best practices. You can interact with people who are doing the same things that you're doing and trying to advance diversity within their institutions. And then you make sure that you're asking for data, right? You see my face is doing this Brooklyn thing where I'm like, are you asking for data? We're going to get into that in a little bit. Today's conference is fantastic because I'm going to talk to you and hopefully inspire you to engage. After that, you'll then be talking about both data and then also how to make sure DEI is in the DNA of your organization. Perfect follow up. And what I'm going to say is because there's a lot of talk, but the action piece is really where I want to get to. The reason why the needle is not moving is because the action piece, in my mind, is missing. So I would love for you to answer the question on the screen. I'm going to move the slide. You'll see the slide on the Menti has changed, and I'll put it in the chat again, the link. In 3 words or phrases, why do you think diversity and inclusion in your organization may be challenged and maybe it's not working the way that you want to? So take a moment and do this quick exercise. It's going to give you 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes for this, and I'll make sure that the internet is working today if things are coming in. So think about this. In 3 words or phrases, why hasn't the needle been moved significantly in your own organization? So not in the profession generally, but in your own organization. Why? So again, this is anonymous. Can't tell who you are, just how many responses I've got. And I've got 75 people on. That means that I should be getting some good, significant. Okay, I see some stuff coming in, and I'm going to show you what comes in. It's going to populate a word cloud for you. And it is an important piece because sometimes if we're having conversations, we'll say the things, but this is a chance for you to tell me in the confessional of the ACC NCR, what do you think is happening in your organization? And I have a theory about what's going to show up because I have conversations about this all the time, but I'd love to see what actually does. And that'll help me to guide our conversation a little bit more. And I can't wait to hear what your thoughts are about what you see. So we've got about 45 minutes, seconds more for your responses. I've got 21 responses so far. And I'll just say that if I was a betting gal, and maybe I am, I see the word that I thought I was going to see. And we're going to talk about it. Keep on going. Make sure you hit submit. I have confirmed that the internet does indeed work here. All right. 20 seconds more. Got 35 responses. Okay, so I'm going to share the screen with you so you can start to see what you're all saying. Okay. Oh, and I see some people are putting things in the chat as well. So for the people who are in the chat who might have just joined, I'm going to give you this link again so that you can participate in what we're doing online. Maybe I'm going to do that. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Okay, there it is. Now take a look at this. Look at this word cloud that's populating. You see that word right in the middle, fair? I see that I hear that, I engage and interact with that pretty much every single day. Remember when I said this is not easy? It's also scary because when you're advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion, you're also advancing, supporting, and encouraging change. And what I know for sure is that people don't like change, right? Because it makes us do things differently than we had done them before. Let's see what else we have. Inertia, denial, ignorance, resistance, time, focus, risk. My favorite. Risk and fear go together. Leadership, not sure where to start. Lack of accountability, see, exactly. Too big, inexperienced. People are moving too fast, uneducated, fear of making mistakes, fear of the unknown, collective executive buy-in, unconscious bias, absolutely white privilege. Coming out of the COVID budge, certainly, right? We have been in this inertia, which that word makes sense there too, given that we're still in this pandemic. Empathy, no support, uncertainty, other priorities, single focus diversity. So this is not too touchy-feely. Okay, see, now I want you to now, the screen has shifted and it says questions or comments. I want to hear what you thought about the actual word cloud that just came up. Did you expect fear to be the word that was going to be there? Did you, some of the things that you expect to see not show up? And that's going to be in statements, and I won't show them. So you can say whatever you want to say to me. I'll read them to you. This for me is such an important piece. I love to use anonymizing tools because when it comes to diversity, there is this fear there. The reason that I know for sure that the needle is not moving is because people are scared. And because the commitment that it takes to make change requires this momentum. And that often that momentum is lacking if we think that the responsibility is outside of us. If all of us are saying that it's our I, we are going to shift this. And that's why I encourage you. I'm saying, let's not be the choir. Let's go sing someplace else, not here, somewhere else. We take what we've learned today and do something else. Someone said they didn't expect fear. I can just tell you this. It is significant. Think about this. If the legal profession at its top is primarily white and male, and in order to shift that and want to have more diversity, that means that there's got to be, I'm giving them a gift basket of change every single day. And they're like, I don't want it, Paula. Nope, try. No, thank you. Let me see what else you're saying. Okay, let's see. You said, not surprised. I didn't think about fear, but it makes sense. Not expecting fear. A lot of organizations place the burden on employees of color. Certainly. That's also a place of fear, right? If you engage and you put resources out that says, we're going to hire a DEI consultant, we're going to bring in somebody to be in charge of DEI, that's also a fear. Then are you going to give them power? Are you going to allow them to actually shift your culture? This is, yep, okay. So it's a visceral response. Okay, all right, so good. So we're aligned in the same place. So let's jump back into some more of the content. Thank you for taking part in that. And you can use that slide to tell me anything else that you'd love to tell me in terms of questions and answers. I'll check it periodically as I continue to go through my own slides. So I want to delve in a little bit more about the reasons that I knew it wasn't working and some of the things that you identified. Right? Identifying the issue, right? What is the underlying cause of the issue that diversity, equity, inclusion is not advancing in our profession and just generally? What is it? I mean, I know systemically, we are dealing with racism, sexism, and the impact on our society and how that trickles down into education, institutions, and access. Right? All of that means that it's going to be, the pipeline shrinks as we get into our profession. And then there's a lot of opportunity and options. And so to make yourself an employer of choice, to make yourself someplace, or to make your institution somewhere that people are going to say, I'm going to go, that is hard, particularly because people are looking often for representation, right? So then you have this 360 that happens where you're like, I want to see somebody in leadership. I need to get folks who are in the, within the pipeline. And there's this struggle in terms of systemic, institutional engagement. I also see that people look at DEI as a separate siloed thing. It's not. Anytime you're doing strategic planning, any of those other things, DEI should not be like, oh yes, and DEI, right? We have to make the DEI agenda. No, DEI should be incorporated in everything. It's the lens, right? Like the glasses lens that we look at for all the things that we do, or else we're not doing it right. That's really where the inclusion is. So the stated desire for diversity, oh yes, of course. I'm going to say it, but then what are we going to do after that? Either the same thing. I looked at some of the data that came from the ACC NCR's reporting on what your members said. And there was a lot of, yes, we're doing this one thing, or we're doing these two things, and we continue to do those things. And I am telling you, because I'm going to get into a lot of I's in the next 10 minutes, that innovation is really where the shift comes from. Okay. You saw that there's fear, there's also lack of trust, right? You can say we care about diversity, we're committed. I love commitments, but commitments are not just in words, they require sustained strategic action. I talked about this. We're here, we wanna go elsewhere and tell people. We wanna leave here. Can I have homework assignments for you? I know you're excited, right? I'm a coach at my heart. That means that you're gonna leave here and you're gonna talk about what you've learned. That is your I for today, because it will change the game versus just internalizing what you're learning. All right, data. The last bullet here, take a deep breath before I put it up there. Data's scary. In the end, we're lawyers, yes, right? And if we ask for data, what are we going to do with it? Are we allowed to ask for the data? What if, my goodness, nails biting, I can tell you this, there's no I in data, but there is an I in risk, and we don't like it. So what are we gonna do? Because in order to move the needle, we have to do some things differently. And I would love to encourage you to think about my eyes. Again, I'm a big fan of alliteration. So I was saying to my husband, he's like, that's a lot of eyes. Watch. Individuals, that's one eye. This is what you can do. I investigate. It can't just be that you're saying okay, great, I want to be involved in diversity. I want diversity to be important. You have to investigate. What are you doing? As in-house attorneys, sometimes you are seen as a friend, sometimes you're seen as a foe in terms of the enterprise-wide DEI initiatives. But it's important to know what's currently happening outside, meaning inside but outside, and then also within your legal department. And the challenge is you may have a legal department that's 3 people, or you can have 300 people, right, or 2,000 people, but still understanding if there's a commitment and then what it is enterprise-wide is important, so that you can align and hopefully then jump and do even more. There's nothing stopping you from doing more. But what data is currently being collected? What are we doing with that data? Just knowing what currently is happening can allow you to now think, how can I innovate? Interpret that. We have seen that we've committed to, having a greater pipeline. In that looking at the pipeline, we've noticed that the data that we're given about, applicants in our organization doesn't really show the diversity that we're looking for. Who is in charge of reviewing said data? Informing stakeholders on status. So oftentimes, unfortunately, you'll have stakeholders who will say, you are the person who is going to be in charge of DEI because you care about it. And unfortunately, particularly if you're a person of color, and often a woman, or even at that intersection, there's an increased burden that is placed on you that says, you've got to do even more, and then I am outsourcing that to you. No, you can inform stakeholders on status if you're in charge, but this has to be a priority for everyone, and they have to be incorporated into this. And in fact, I would love for leaders to state that this is important, to then show that it's important, to take on the learning, and to not just outsource these pieces. It has to be that we're all addressing our I. My favorite I here is innovate. You don't have to do what's already been done. Think about your own particular institution. Who are we? What are we trying to do? What has been done already? How are we holding people accountable to what we said that we were going to do? And then what can we do differently? A brainstorming session that literally says, what can we do? I would love to do that every 6 months. I know organizations who are doing this, particularly around not just recruiting, but the retention piece, right? Saying, we want to make sure as we're figuring out how to bring more folks in, that we're keeping the people we have here. So whether that's innovation by saying, okay, maybe folks are a little bit afraid of asking for data around equity, for example, pay. Yes, it's fear. Should you do it? Yes. Are people willing to do it? Not so much. Should they think about doing it? Absolutely. But there are other places that you can look for innovation in terms of data. So I have a client who wanted to do a mentoring program because they realized that people didn't know the trajectory internally within their organization, right? They knew that they were there, they knew that there was a GC, but what could they do? What was the opportunity for them to learn, to develop, et cetera? And so they decided their mentoring program was going to be folks who onboarded, right? There's two people who are in charge of onboarding, a commitment there. They also created they created SOPs, standard operating procedures, so that if the event there was any attrition, they would be able to provide that to somebody else if they left, right? So that's important. You want to make sure you concretize, I think I might have just made that up, what is going on so that it doesn't get lost with the individuals. Then they made sure that people had literally in your role, this is the opportunity for professional development. These are the people who've done this before. They even incorporated alumni into their mentoring. They've had panels that said that when I was there, I did this. It's important to make sure that people have an understanding of how and what. The place in which diversity and inclusion is challenged is when people don't have information. Equity means providing information. Inclusion means making people feel as if they belong by providing them the keys in order to be impactful and effective within your organization. So we could talk about this all day. I'm here to inspire. Hopefully it's working already. Integrate DEI on all fronts. I said this already. This lens has to be, I am doing this internally. I'm also talking to my external outside clients and other vendors and partners about what our commitment is and how they can help us to get to that place. Those things, like loving all the eyes, impact the workplace, improve the legal profession, and require additional and continued investment and insight. Okay, I wanna see what you're saying in the chat and see if there's any questions. Are you impressed at all of my eyes? I have some people in the chat saying, yes, okay, awesome. Let me see what you're saying on the Menti, if there's any other things I want to respond to, because I do want you to ask me questions. Okay, yes, someone says, innovation is important. It is so important, right? We can't continue to do the same things and think that we're going to have different outcomes. We're just not. We're not. But I will say this to you is that sometimes when people are saying they're doing the same things, they're actually not, because they're not holding people accountable in the things that they have actually said. So, right? If you're actually saying we're doing it and wanting to do it, but then not holding people accountable, then you're not actually doing it. We're lawyers. We're really good at influencing. That's another eye, right? And so I'm going to give you some homework. I'm going to give you some homework. So take a look at this. And I will share the slides, so don't be afraid. You don't have to write everything down. I'll give these to folks. Okay, we already know the pipeline of where DEI is impactful in the organization, right? That pipeline, it can't just be one of these. And that's why I really love that you have the DEI maturity model, the ACC. I mean, it's really a fantastic place to take a snapshot of where you are, okay? So I have another question for you that I'd like you to answer right now. So you'll see the Menti has changed. Have you reviewed the ACC DEI maturity model? So go ahead and answer that question. I want to know what you've done, and there's some questions on the screen, and then I will share with you, because we as lawyers ask for tools often, we ask for data often, but I'm encouraging you to use the data, right? Okay, and okay, let's see what you got here. I mean, what a wonderful collaboration of content from not just ACC, but ACC, the foundation. Shout out to Jen, hi. Look at this. You have a fantastic tool at your fingertips. I reviewed it and I was like, oh my gosh, I wish I was involved in this. I will send my edits later. We're gonna continue to make this happen, but I love the fact that it is there as a tool. Essentially, and I'm sure it's gonna be talked about later on, but that you can look and say, this is where we are, and this is what we're doing, and how can we make goals and set goals to move to the next step, to see where we are in our DEI trajectory. It is powerful, made for in-house attorneys, right? That's the answer. You're gonna talk about that later on. But take a look, glance at it. I'm not sure what that is. We're gonna change those two. It's going to be yes, 100% the next time this question is asked, okay? All right. Just wanted to show you that. And I also noticed that there's not as many answers that I would like here. Again, it's anonymous. You can just tell me, it's fine. All right. That was helpful. Let's see. I know, okay, I've got 5 minutes. I know, I hate when this happens, but I'm gonna give you homework before I get off. So take a look here. Oops. Oh, you're gonna ask the questions and comments here. I'm gonna go to this other screen. I am like a DJ, hold on. All right, there it is. Now here's your homework. I would not be a good coach if I did not say this is what you're gonna do next. Why does this keep happening? Sorry. All right, now here it is. Did it work? Am I in the wrong screen? Okay, in the meantime, I'm just gonna keep talking. So I want you to do this. I want you to, one, take what you're doing today, what you've learned today. I hope you're taking vigorous notes. And the next thing you're gonna do is to say, this is where I attended and this is what I learned. Literally put it on the agenda of the next thing you're gonna do. You might be thinking to yourself, why, how? No, you have to do this. I went to this thing, I learned this, and I would like you to see this tool. I want you to take the DEI maturity model, and I want you to then say, all of us, whether we have 3 or 300 in our stakeholders meeting, to look at it and say, where do you think that we are as an organization? Don't talk about it before, ask where you think we are, and then use that as a catalyst for conversation. Because what I will tell you is that people will say different things. Oh, we're definitely all the way over there, when you know all that's been done is a statement. Right? So it's a good way to kind of measure and say, the rubber hits the road here. We're not where you think we are, and what we're saying does not equate what we're doing. And this can be a catalyst for us to do differently versus to continue on in the same place where we have been, which has not necessarily moved that needle, as we mentioned before. Okay. So yes. We want people to be, yes, I'm looking at some of the comments in terms of what's coming on. And I'm gonna just close that for a minute because I do wanna show you this one last slide before we leave. And now I'm inviting you to ask me questions via the chat while I close this out, or any place else. I wanna make sure that we have the opportunity for us to engage in my last few minutes a little bit more. What questions do you have while I show you this? Okay, what is a good next step? I mean, I think that what I just said to you is a perfect next step. It is to take what you have learned, and you're going to be talking about this much more later on. Look at this. Now, here we go. Here's what I wanted to show you. This is what you're going to do. You're going to ask questions. You're going to ask stakeholders. Then you're going to set goals for yourself. Now, any good coach will tell you, you can't just set goals and not do anything. You have to hold yourself accountable. You're putting DEI in your agenda, right? You're saying, you know, whatever we're doing, whether it's recruiting, whether it's pipeline work, whether it's thinking about professional development and how we support our talent pipeline, even how we engage with our outside counsel, how are we measuring that, right? You're talking about data later. I want you to actualize it for yourselves. How are you getting support? The great thing that you have from outside vendors is they want to help you because they want to keep your business. Ask them for help, right? You've got tons of DEI professionals who are internal in law firms who can provide you with best practices and resources that they access all the time so that you're not in this alone, okay? And I'm going to remind you of a couple of things. My favorite thing is this. You are the I in both DEI because you're advancing inclusion, and you're the individual that's going to make an impact. I don't want you to think it's nothing you can do. It's not them, it's you. And individual influence for institutional and industry DEI impact. Individual influence, that's you, for institutional and industry-wide DEI impact. The answer is you. Collectively, we come together and we shift the game. So I hope that we will stay connected with each other. I know that our time is done. I'm sorry it went too quickly. It always does. I want to give you tons of information. Don't think that this is the last time we were going to interact and engage with each other. I wish you wonderful and impactful conversation. I'm going to look at this. What are the strategies that best work to engage those who have never experienced racism? First of all, we've all experienced racism. We're in a society which is impacted by racism. So whether or not you are one of the, what you would think of as like an individual, we are all impacted by racism and the system of it. And so thinking about that way versus individually can help us to understand that we are all a part of the answer. And education is where you should start with. If you have not done any education institutionally, it's hard to have conversation if you're not speaking the same language. Now, with that, unfortunately, my time is up. I want to say, Sharifa, I'm sending it back to you. I look forward to all of you connected with me. Your other homework is to connect with me on LinkedIn. Have a wonderful rest of your day with fruitful conversation around DEI. Take it away, Sharifa.
Thanks, Paula. On behalf of our chapter, I would like to extend a special thank you to you. Thanks for joining us all the way from sunny Jamaica. Today's objective is to offer the audience practical ways to move the DEI needle within their organizations. And with all of the eyes that you have provided us today, you certainly have given us some takeaways. Your insights have certainly provided keys for many to start the disruptions necessary to impact their company's DEI. Thank you for being here and speaking with us today, Paula.
Great, thanks, Shannon. Welcome back from break, everyone. We're now going to transition to our first sponsored session of the day, and we're pleased to present Ogletree Deacons to discuss DEI data, the key to the kingdom. My name is Cindy Boyle, and I'm General Counsel of Employment Law at Willis Towers Watson. I'm also a member of the Programming Subcommittee of the ACC NCR DEI Committee, and I'm serving today as the chapter's host for this session. As a reminder, if you have a question during this session, please use the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and the panel will address your questions as time permits. As another reminder and disclaimer, all remarks made by the panelists are their own opinions and do not constitute legal advice or necessarily reflect the viewpoints of their company or firm or of ACC NCR. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our panel for today's presentation. Lauren Hicks is of counsel in the Ogletree Deacons Atlanta office. She devotes the majority of her practice to representing federal contractors and subcontractors in compliance evaluations and administrative enforcement actions triggered by the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, or OFCCP. She counsels employers on the preparation, management, and defense of their affirmative action programs and related matters, including jurisdictional analyses and preventative strategy. Lauren has extensive experience with investigating and resolving systemic discrimination issues stemming from statistical disparities in hiring, compensation, and testing, and has litigated numerous claims before courts and administrative agencies. Aisha Massengale is Vice President, Deputy General Counsel, Employment and Teammate Relations for Under Armour, Inc., a marketer and distributor of branded performance apparel, footwear, and accessories for men, women, and youth. In that role, Aisha oversees all employment-related legal matters as well as all employee-related investigations for Under Armour globally. Aisha also serves as a member of the company's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council. Paul Keogh currently works at Leidos, Inc. as Vice President, Senior Assistant General Counsel, Employment Law, where he advises on all labor and employment matters. Previously, Paul held a similar role at Booz Allen Hamilton and was a senior counsel at Seyfarth Shaw. He also served as Special Assistant Attorney Advisor to the Honorable Victoria Lipnick, Commissioner of the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. While at the EEOC, he provided legal and political counsel to Commissioner Lipnick regarding all policy matters confronting the EEOC, including regulations and enforcement guidance documents and all aspects of agency business. With that, we can begin today's presentation. I am now going to turn it over to Lauren Hicks. Lauren?
Thank you so much. Let me see if I can get the slides going. You all see my slides?
Yes.
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 Thanks so much for joining us. We're really happy to be here discussing one of my favorite topics and one that I know a lot of you are probably keenly interested in. The amount of information that we're all being asked to share, to see, to analyze, to think about has just differed even from, of course, 3 or 5 years ago. And so this is a good area to be focused on and putting some resources in. And I'll circle back to this topic before the end of the presentation, but it's also keenly important to know that whatever you're dealing with now, whether your organization is sort of just starting a DEI journey, maybe you don't even capture data or you're not sure if you capture data, all the way through if you have a really robust DEI program, or maybe you're a federal contractor colleague of mine and you spend a lot of time on your data thanks to OFCCP obligations and more. But I think it's really important to keep in mind that more is coming, right? So to the extent you're feeling like, okay, we're sort of, this is an important area, or we're behind the 8 ball, or it's something that we're getting a lot of pressure in, I think that's all fair and correct, but I certainly think more is coming. States are getting in on certain DEI laws. There are just social and cultural considerations and a lot more to think about than there has been in the past. And so this ball is moving forward, and something I've been telling a lot of clients of mine, recently is sort of adapt or be prepared for problems. So thanks again for joining us, and hopefully we can talk about something that's helpful to your organization today. So a little bit of background if the topic is new to you, and I know for reference on this group of attendees, we've got a pretty wide variety of organizations from very small to very, very large. And so I think there's probably quite a differential between folks on the call as far as what you're doing, what you're capturing, what your concerns or your pressures are. And so if it's newer to you or you don't have a lot of background in this area, DEI doesn't have a single definition. It's sort of morphs over time, and it's dependent on a lot of things. But some of the things that we think about when we're talking about, looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion data are listed on this slide. So disability status is one that's very interesting and intriguing. And of course, my federal contractor colleagues are very familiar with that. Sexual orientation, gender identity, these are newer areas of focus, sort of moving into the DE&I context. Oftentimes, there's not quite as much data being captured on those types of areas, so they're a little bit more difficult to assess for a lot of organizations. And there's less benchmarking as well, less history of benchmarking. And so that's another problem in trying to figure out what you want to assess with that data. Race and ethnicity and gender are the biggest two, I would say, the ones that when most people are thinking about DE&I, they're talking generally speaking about race and ethnicity and gender. Age is another one. Obviously, it has some special considerations, and it is unique in that almost every workforce does have that information. So unlike a lot of others, even if your organization may be a little bit behind in capturing data, that's one point you probably have. Veteran status is another one that's been getting some push over time. And again, federal contractors have obligations in that regard, but it could be any other number of things. Political affiliation, genetic information. There's a wide variety of things that could fall under this umbrella. And it's important for you to think about these types of fields and what might be interesting to your organization or important that you want to capture and assess before you could really start making decisions about what you can or should do in that regard. All right, so DEI data collection. Like we said, most common, we're talking race and ethnicity and gender. It's quite common that employers ask for that information, maybe for their EEO-1, for their current employees, maybe on the application for applicants, especially my federal contractor colleagues, of course, are doing that, but other organizations do that as well. So that tends to be a piece of information that a lot of entities have, whether or not you're analyzing it. There are state and federal reporting requirements and some rules that may be applicable to you when you're thinking about that information and what you can do with it. And I would also note there's a really big distinction to make sure you're being careful as you think about what you'd like to do or what you are doing, whether you're discussing your current employees versus applicants. Across the board, your legal obligations differ, your rights may differ, and so be diligent when you're thinking about these things and before you engage in any type of activity that you're doing a really good assessment of, am I talking employees or am I talking applicants, because the laws are quite different. My federal contractor friends on the call are very familiar with these obligations. If you're not a federal contractors have very rigid and intensive obligations to capture these fields of information as well as some others. And not just to capture them, but to do a significant amount of annual statistical analyses regarding them. So they're running analyses to compare their workforce to the availability in their area. They're also running statistical analyses of their applicants. How many men applied to this job? How many did we hire? How many women applied to this job? How many did we hire? And then they're doing the same types of analyses for terminations and promotions and compensation. And compensation is a whole separate beast. So we'll come back to that topic as well. when you think about the DEI data, the data alone relates to someone's identity, how they identify their gender maybe, or their disability status, their race, or their ethnicity, these types of really important things, right? It's who am I as a human? It's when we start combining that data with other pieces of information that makes it, sort of relate to employment decisions. So, the fact that I may identify as a female is just my identity until you start looking at, okay, now we're comparing the compensation of females in my organization to the compensation of males, right? So you have that information related to maybe compensation, hires, etc. This information is generally captured. And again, if this is newer to your organization, work with counsel. Don't just sort of go out and start asking people information. There's a lot of rules and regulations to think about here, but it's captured, generally speaking, via what we call voluntary self-identification, or self-ID is what it's typically called. If you don't capture it, you can't analyze it. And I will tell you, this is a very real problem for a lot of organizations. It tends to be a bigger problem, I would say, for applicants. If you come to me and you say, we cannot seem to get any female engineers, we don't have female engineers in our workforce, what's going on with that? Well, there are a lot of things that could be going on with it, right? But one of the things we need to look at to know the answer to that question is, well, are you getting a sufficient number of female applicants? And if you're getting a sufficient number of female applicants, are they qualified applicants? If they are qualified applicants, where are they falling out of your process since they're not being hired, right? We call that sort of a step or phase analysis. But we can't do any of those things if we don't capture on the front end your applicants' gender information. And so a lot of it depends, again, what you have and what you want to do. You need to think about that for creating your systems and what you do ask for. But again, don't just sort of jump and start adding random questions here and there. Make sure you work very diligently with your counsel, because there are a lot of rules and regulations and you wouldn't want to sort of go stray of them. Information can be incredibly helpful. We'll talk about that more in the presentation. That's really what a lot of the commentary that Aisha and Paul are going to share with you, how useful that information can be. Surveys that are done correctly, self-ID surveys, they can measure and even foster a sense of inclusion, right? So, for example, federal contractors to survey their workforce for disability status and to do it at regular intervals. I generally encourage clients to do it annually, but they don't have to do it quite that often, but they have to do it with some regularity. And when they do, you can do it in a lot of different ways. You can just send out a paper or a link and say, everyone fill this out, or you can use it as an opportunity to tie it into other initiatives, to present a really welcoming message and talk about how valued individuals with disabilities are, and here are all the programs we have. Here's a way we can work with you on reasonable accommodations. You can do a lot of things to make it seem more comfortable and welcoming, and to assure them that their data is protected. And that's very important as well. People really are much more comfortable disclosing data if they know that it's protected. It's not going to go to my manager and things like that. So think about, when you are doing those types of things, what messaging do you want to put on it, whether it's a question on an application or whether it's an email to sort of re-solicit ID information. Data storage, pulling the data, and system changeovers. So we don't have time to really get into these topics today, but I just wanted to highlight them. Anytime you're talking about data and collecting it, you also need to be thinking about data privacy, right? So how are we storing it? It's probably captured in your applicant tracking system and or your HRIS. Once it's in those systems, you need to create special protections to limit the access to that information, right? So that should be priority number one is, all right, we're collecting data. How do we limit the permissions and make it as appropriate and narrow as possible to only those who need access to this particular data? And then Storage, you may have record keeping requirements. For example, my federal contractor colleagues have very specific record keeping requirements. You may have state record keeping requirements, so on and so forth. And then the other thing I just want to note, even though it may feel like a little bit of a strange thing to mention, it's highly relevant. When you transfer either your applicant tracking system or your HRIS to a new system, make sure you own your data, you have copies of your data, because I can tell you this is something I deal with on a weekly basis, right? Client transition from one system to the other. They can't access their data, or they can't access it in a usable format, or they can access it, but with some kind of really massive fee from their prior vendor. So it is incredibly important to understand, both with your current vendor, but especially as you transition systems, where's my data? How can I have access to it? How can I keep it in a usable format? And when you're transitioning systems, think about how far back do I want to go? And what kinds of data dump can I get from that old system that I can keep on hand so I have my compliance as needed. All right, so moving on into the sort of larger considerations around DEI data. And we talked a little bit about there are a lot of legal requirements and there's limitations, and a lot of this is really a risk tolerance issue. Sort of where is your organization willing to tolerate a little bit of risk or not? Compliance is a big issue. My federal contractor colleagues on the phone understand you have tremendous volumes of OFCCP obligations annually. We have the new OFCCP contractor portal certification that goes live this year for the first time. As of June 30, you have to have certified your compliance if you are within the definition of a federal contractor. And so you want to make sure you're really on top of these programs and that things are very orderly, because someone is making a certification under potential criminal penalty that yes, we've done what we needed to do to analyze our data, and so on and so forth. Business and cultural considerations are huge. And with that, I'm gonna ask Aisha, looking at this slide, we got legal requirements and compliance and business and culture. Can you tell me a little bit about what types of requests or pressure or interest you've been seeing the last year or two from your organization or outsiders?
Sure. Thanks. First of all, good morning to everyone. Appreciate all the folks who made the choice to be here on a Friday. So thank you for that. We see it. I will go back to a couple of things. At our organization, we have a phrase that we make data-driven decisions, right? And so when you hold yourself out and you say, we make data-driven decisions, and you give feedback to groups that, well, you don't have the data to support it. They say, okay, great, well, give me the data. And then you go, wait, I didn't mean that exactly like that. And so you're trying to balance, what you can provide the information that the people really need. And I always start from a place of, what is it that you need it for? And what do you intend to do with it? And so there is always this tension, I think, with a myriad of groups that I think we're going to talk about in a little bit, who want to see the data. And then I would also just be candid in terms of the last, 2+ years, sparked by Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, that there's just been a lot more activism of I know our teammates in particular who have been interested in knowing, where do we stand, right? I'm going to ask, I want to know, where do we stand within this organization? And even more so, where does the organization stand with respect to us? So we get a lot of pressure, culturally, to share more data, be more open about the data. So I'll just pause there. Those are just a couple things top of mind.
I think that's very familiar. And Paul, I'm guessing you may have commentary of the same, or you're seeing the same types of things?
Yeah, we are certainly seeing the same types of the same types of pressures and requests. And ultimately, a lot of our employees know, hey, look, you have this EEO1 report. Why don't you just tell us what all the data says? And then you also have pressure from and I don't necessarily want to call it pressure, but requests from, the board of directors and executives, and the kind of push behind the request is, well, I don't know if I have a problem. Tell me if I have a problem. Show me where it is, and then I can take steps in order to fix the problem. So that goes to Aisha's comment of, well, what are you going to do with the data? And that's when people like me get really scared. Okay, you go into an executive and you say, here's your diversity slate, and the executive may say, well, okay, well, I know how to fix this problem. I'll just go out and hire a female engineer for a particular position, and that goes a little bit too far. So from the legal perspective, I think the idea is to get into those conversations to try and change behaviors, but do it in a legally compliant way, which always presents challenges, as you know.
I just have to piggyback on something that Paul said, because I always get fired up about this point. I always say I went into the law because they said there'd be no math. And so one of the ways that I think about DE&I is behaviors, right? When we at Under Armour started on some of this journey, we'd get the response from some of our leaders say, well, tell me the number I need to hit. What are the numbers and what do I need to hit? And I just would shake my head and try to remain really calm. And, I have a magnificent partner in the head of DE&I at Under Armour, who's just doing amazing work. And we really are lockstep in a lot of this. And we talk about the behaviors. If you change the behaviors, that actually drives the numbers. It's not give me the number and then I'll go get the number, because if you don't change the underlying behaviors at your organization, you can't maintain it. And so I just had to, that. I'm just very passionate about that particular point about the behaviors, because ultimately the environment that you create at your organization is really the thing that helps you to improve all of your numbers that we're talking about today.
That is, honestly, that could take the rest of the presentation. Really, truly, this is the heart of DEI. And I don't mind saying, when I work with clients, especially over the last couple of years, I heard a lot of that, right? Well, we're just going to set a target that we're going to hire X% females. We're going to hire X% African Americans. We're going to, next 3 executives we hire, we're going to make sure that they are minorities or females, and people just coming up with all these things, right? And I think it comes from a place of good. The difficult part there is it really can come from a place of good and wanting to see results, but wanting to see results and wanting to fix what's wrong are really 2 very different things. And I think that's, something that I have the hardest time, getting to the why behind it is the harder work. People want to take the shortcut, and the shortcuts are not meaningful. And for what it's worth, because I used to work at the Department of Labor, I worked for OFCCP for almost 8 years. I know that they view it internally in the government the same way. You shouldn't want a shortcut. You should be figuring out what is wrong with your systems that is creating or causing these problems in the first place. So if you think your organization has too few women or minorities as you rise through the ranks, which I will tell you is a very common problem because I look at data all day, every day. The issue isn't, oh, we're going to put 3 females in executive roles so that we can now say we have 3 more females and that makes our numbers better. The issue is why? Why do we have that historically? What's going on with that? Are we not looking at enough women when the jobs come open? Is it a tap on the shoulder situation for these higher ranking jobs and that's leading to less diversity, things like that? So it's getting to those underlying practices. The why with data is everything. Data in and of itself, it doesn't tell you the story. It doesn't tell you the end. What you should care more about is the underlying why. How did we get there if we have any type of data concern? So I agree with you both. That's really the heart, I think, of this conversation. And it's also the one that has been a little bit difficult to manage over the last couple of years, because there's been a lot of desire for, I want something different now, so that if I do have to publicize my data, it's going to look better today because we're an open organization and we don't discriminate and so on and so forth. But you gotta hold back, right, your people and say, listen, we have to figure out the why. Let's do this the right way. Let's figure out, do we have a retention problem with women and minorities? Do we have, a closed system where it's just tap on the shoulder and there's not enough opportunities, or whatever else it may be? But focusing on those things is what really matters. And it's a lot more work and it's a lot more resources, but it's what will get your organization to where it wants to be. Let's go to the next slide. Let's see if it'll let me go. There we go. So when we talk about DEI data, we've been focused a lot on your internal sort of employment representation or your hiring statistics, your compensation statistics, and all of those are really, really important. That's what I spend all my time in, so I think they're very important. But when we're talking DEI, you should understand that there's, more areas of programming that you really want to be thinking about, making sure that you're considering or assessing or pouring resources into as may be appropriate. So this is not certainly a comprehensive list, but you may want to think about training, employee resource groups. What do you have? Do you need more of them? Are they getting good attendance? Do they have the resources they need? Succession planning, evaluations, and promotions. I'm spending a lot of time on the issues here because, like I said, we're trying to figure out why there are glass ceilings and or compensation issues, and a lot of times they tie to these issues of promotion and succession planning and evaluation. So I would say don't sleep on these areas, right? If you're doing compensation analysis, a lot of times there can be temptation to sort of laser obsess over starting compensation. And listen, starting compensation is very important. But for example, if your organization has other practices that may compound that initial decision, that may really be one or all of the issue that you need to change and think about. So don't sleep on these issues, which are maybe don't get, I think, as much attention as recruiting and base salary and things like that. Your leadership engagement and development, again, that's an area, I'm in a second I'll ask Paul and Aisha, I'm guessing they're seeing a lot more interest, engagement, and more resources in that regard. Something that I have noticed in my clients, a big increase in the last couple of years. Suppliers and vendors, now this is a really big space. If it hasn't happened to you yet, I would say you're lucky, but it probably will. Lots of business partners are asking for, do you have affirmative action plans, or can I have your DEI data, or just certain representations that are sometimes very detailed and specific. Give us this piece of information, give us that piece of information. And so your organization needs to be prepared for those types of requests and think about how you want to handle them. And please always funnel them through your legal counsel because they are very important to think about diligently. And then community engagement and philanthropy. And again, that tied to leadership engagement is one where I think I've witnessed in my clients in the last couple of years, tremendous increase in interest and willingness to put resources forward and share them publicly and things like that. So Aisha, what are you seeing in any or all of these areas, and what do you think are kind of the most important ones to actively manage or think about?
Well, I think first, I have a soft spot for the folks in recruiting because I think the knee-jerk reaction anytime DE&I comes up is like, we have to, recruit more minorities and women. And again, if the environment is not right and healthy, then you end up having a retention problem. And how that plays itself out is, for example, in succession planning, in promotion, et cetera, because when you go to fill new roles, there's a pipeline problem because you have a retention problem. So first you have a sourcing problem, and the recruiters work awfully hard to try to fix that. But then the pipeline dries up if you don't have an environment that works for these groups. So certainly making sure that we stay on top of that. I think our company has done a lot of work in the succession planning and promotion, making sure that the steps are taken to ensure a proper pipeline. From a supplier vending, we've actually looked more internally at ourselves to say, when we are sourcing for suppliers and vendors, are we making sure that we are touching all kinds of women and minority business enterprises as we look to fill contractual needs? So we are trying to be more proactive in that regard. And then, the community engagement always exerts, again, pressure is like an awful word, but just a lot of energy around making sure that we are really, really engaged in the right ways with our communities and our philanthropic. I'll just use an example. We're actually building out a new campus, and one of the things that we're doing is a new track and field. And so we've had a lot of conversations about how do we ensure access for local community folks. We're headquartered in Baltimore. What are we doing to make sure that the community folks actually have access to this facility, that it's not just reserved for super special kinds of groups? And so we just try to weave it into all of these things. And then I would just say, our we call them teammate resource groups, our employee resource groups, are a tremendous source of information, feedback, requests. And so we have to pay a lot of feed and watering to those groups as well.
That's really interesting and very good. And do you feel like, is that an area where you think executives or others are just more willing to sort of pay attention and focus on really doing the right things? I mean, do you think overall you've seen sort of positive progress in these areas of being willing to really engage the community and put resources where they matter?
Yeah, I don't want to sound like I'm doing a commercial, but we have, an incredible endeavor that is about to really be launched. There was kind of a soft launch that folks may have seen on LinkedIn about access to sport and attacking what we call sport deserts, because there is such a tie for us between, kids who are allowed to engage in sport and their, success trajectory. And so that's a really natural connection for us to make sure that we're also overlaying the DE&I lens with everything that we do. So, it's not just access to sport in inner city, access to sport in rural places. It's really a universal look at how sport can kind of connect our organization to community. And so there's a lot of passion around that. And I'll say, our CEO is amazing. He went and recently did a road show with all of our TRGs, all of our employee resource groups, listening session, feedback session, answering the tough questions. And he talked about his own journey where he thought, being kind of a global citizen, he lived in all these different countries, that he was really ahead of the game with respect to DE&I. He knew what he was doing, and he works directly with the head of this one organization, and they did like an intercultural development assessment, and he was really disappointed in his numbers, and it was really eye-opening for him. And so I think what you need from your leaders is that willingness to do that introspective work, and then it gets spun around into your level of community engagement and doing it authentically. Because I'll say, when you are only chasing the numbers and you have leaders who say, well, I'm going to get the woman. Think about the position that you're putting that woman in when everyone else in the workforce is like, oh, she just got it because she's a woman. It starts that person at a disadvantage, like they didn't earn it. And that can also be frustrating. So I'll just leave it there for Paul to chime in.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think those are great points, and I think lots of businesses are frankly, every business is dealing with those kind of issues. I look at this slide and I kind of group some of the different notes here. I think first off, as Aisha said, you have to have leadership engagement, real leadership engagement, because when efforts come from the top and people, employees believe in what the leaders are doing, then the employees are going to follow. In the absence of leadership engagement, then everything else falls away. It really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you do. And I do think, so I lump training and promotions and evaluations and development all into the big bucket. Lauren and Aisha talked about it. It's all about retention. You have to get the people in the door, and then you have to feed them, right? You have to train them. You have to give them stretch opportunities. You have to promote them. You have to develop them in every sense of the word, in order to have that pipeline. Just like Aisha said, most organizations can look at the data, and you can tell where people fall out of your company, and then you have to figure out why, or what can we do to change that. If you're looking at your numbers and you have women falling out of the workforce around age 30 to 35, maybe you need to think about, okay, what programs do we have to have in place so we can keep these folks, right? Because it is so much easier to train and develop and promote than to try and fix a problem solely through recruiting. I think recruiting and hiring, that's step one. But that only gives you the snapshot of what the data is at that particular time. During the life cycle of somebody's employment, they have to want to stay engaged with the company and with their managers, right? Because people leave managers. When they leave, it's generally because of a manager, or they didn't get the opportunities, they didn't get the stretch opportunities. So you need to think about these issues in order to retain people, because it helps your business to retain people, as opposed to trying to just go out and hire new people and integrating them. So I agree with everything Aisha said, and today's newer employees, the younger employees, are looking for community engagement and philanthropy, and it's important to have those 2 or 3 kind of causes that your company stands for. So at Leidos, we're generally focused on STEM education for younger kids, and then we also have a program where we're getting out and educating people on the opioid crisis. These are issues that aren't going away. So that's how any company, whatever you're focused on, pick 2 or 3 priorities and try to get out there in the community and help the community. But certainly don't limit it to 2 or 3. So start with 2 or 3.
Absolutely. You guys, great points, and all really important to keep your organization moving forward. And we actually got a chat question while you all were talking, to the effect of, all right, you set a program, and then how do you avoid sort of paralysis of that program, right? Okay, we got a program in place. And I think it's so important to understand that DEI is not a set it and forget it thing. It's not like a lot of things where, okay, it's establishing rules, and then once the rules are in place, we're good. That will not work for you. That will never be effective for you. And I want to highlight for my federal contractor friends, this is what the feds are speaking to you right now, right? They're putting the portal in place. They're coming at you with new directives on compensation and enforcement. And that's because they want to move away from, you do your plan, it's a check the box thing, and you move on. If it feels like they're adding a lot more burdens on you, that's the point. That's exactly what they're trying to do. They're saying you all have taken this, as a checklist item, rather than taking it seriously to get to the heart, to put an obligation on yourselves, to change things, to do things, and to look at those deep dive issues, not just the surface level issues. And so I think, to our colleague who asked this question, the issue is making sure that, everyone understands it's not a set it and forget it. You have to do constant analysis and push yourselves to do better. You can do that by reporting, having a DEI committee, including DEI in important leadership roles and meetings, and then holding yourself to account when you are running analyses. That's a big deal, right? Lots of organizations just run the numbers, and again, they want to flash or highlight what they think are good numbers or progress or whatever, but they don't want to do these deep dive issues to figure out, okay, is the problem here that, we say, that we can't get women in leadership positions, but again, it's all tap on the shoulder, or Maybe, you know, we're not assessing performance in a fair way. Maybe that's our underlying issue. By the way, free tip from employment lawyer here who does a lot of this. That's very oftentimes the issue when I start digging into data, right? So that's, again, an area you don't want to sleep on is sort of performance and promotional opportunities and clear and transparent lines of progressions and things like that. But yeah, you have to keep the program rolling by continuing to hold yourself to account and not, you know, not being so caught up in the pat ourselves on the back. Yay, look at our shiny diversity numbers. That's, you know, really not, that's not going to serve you that well. And I know it can be very tempting, and, you know, I'm not here to say there's not a place for that, but it should be a small place. That's really not the goal of doing all the DEI work and assessments. All right,
there's actually, if you Google it, there are like several examples of your DE&I arc, right? And so like phase one, for example, we always like activity, right? So, you know, people are like, what can we do? What can we do? And so your initial phase may be you're putting on, you know, educational programs, you're having speakers come in. That may be phase one. Your second phase is where you're really starting to, I know one of the other programs talked about the DNA, embedding it more into your DNA, and it'll give you examples of what that looks like. And then there's kind of like this final phase that's really the, you know, the panacea that no one ever really achieves, because it is a journey. And I think it's really important to take your data and some of your other environmental assessments and look at those and then kind of plot out where are you in your DE&I journey. Because for me, when we start to get to like what you're willing to share or not, it's going to depend on where you are in your journey. So I just wanted to add that quickly.
Very good point. Absolutely. And there's a really wide range of where your organization is, can be, or where they want to be. And depending on where you are, you can start to add in those layers to move yourself forward, whether you're at the very beginning or further along your path. So I spend all day, every day in hiring and compensation and other types of data. I live and breathe the data, and I'm in Excel looking at information all day. And I just want to highlight for you, you know, getting data, having data is not the end all be all. It's important to think about data in a really precise and accurate way and use it to your advantage to get really meaningful information from it. Okay, so a couple of examples. I had an entity who asked me to run some analysis on their hiring, right? They felt like our diversity is a problem, run some analysis on the hiring and tell us what's going on. Well, when we looked at their hiring at this particular location, which let's say is Atlanta, because I'm in Atlanta, we saw disparities, statistical disparities, meaning concerning numbers on a very large scale. Okay, so we get the results, I give them these numbers, and they start to panic. And I said, whoa, hold up. Because what your numbers are saying to me is you hired 4 people in position X last year, but your number says you had 1,000 plus applicants for 4 hires. That doesn't seem right to me. What's going on here? Well, it turns out when they pulled their data for me, their requisition, the way they posted that job, is posted nationwide. So we were considering every applicant, even though every applicant did not list Atlanta as a location they wanted to be positioned at, we were comparing to the entirety of the pool. Well, that's meaningless analysis, right? On the other hand, sometimes we start looking at the data and we realize, oh, you know, your system isn't running something correctly, or it's missing this really important field that would allow us to analyze things in a better way. Or another problem that I run into very commonly, the opposite of the large pool problem, is the very small pool problem. You have 1 single applicant and 1 person hired for this job. Why is that? Well, either it's because, you know, maybe they tell me that their system did not pull the data correctly. That could be, and that's a huge issue to be sorted out. Or maybe that is actually what happened. Maybe that reflects accurately, you know, the selection process. And so that in and of itself is a different problem, right? It's different if your system isn't pulling the right data versus it is pulling the right data, and that is actually what occurred. And what occurred is, oh, you know, that was so-and-so's buddy who was working at a different competitor. And he wanted, he brought him in here because he knows he's a really sharp guy. And so if that's the case, then that's a whole different systematic issue you may want to think about changing, right? So understanding your data and really digging into the details. And I know I don't mind saying, because again, I do this all the time. I know the data can be very boring. It can be confusing, and it's difficult to wield and manage. So if you have the resources internally, great. If not, reach out. There are lawyers, there are labor economists. There's a lot of people that can help clean and refine and get your data precise and accurate before you are running it. And that is very important to move your program in the right direction, to have meaningful impact of what's going on here. Then once you have right and correct data, you also want to think about these things, which is, okay, don't just do the surface level look, right? If we have problems in our data, look at, okay, is it that we're missing maybe, and these are just a few examples, there are many other things that could be going on in an applicant pool, right? Lack of diverse applicants, that could be an issue. Or we have plenty of applicants, but they're all falling out at the interview phase. Or maybe they're getting screened out by HR and they never even make it to the interview phase, or something else, right? These are all really important underlying things that you need to know to do a meaningful assessment to move yourselves, forward in a positive direction. And I love this one example from a client of mine. They were having a massive frustration getting minorities into their workforce and women, and these in a pretty substantial subset of jobs. And we started analyzing this and looking for these types of things, right? The deeper dive into particular pieces of information. It turns out we were able to identify that their application had one question, which really wasn't that important to the job. It related to temperature of the workplace. And that one question, a lot of people were indicating no on that. It was taking out more than 50% of their female and minority candidates because they were saying no to this question, which really wasn't even that central to their particular job. We removed the question from their application moving forward. And don't you know, something that silly, just a legacy question that wasn't on there necessarily for even a meaningful reason, changed the entire landscape of their recruiting pool and then therefore their hiring. We see the same thing all the time with, are your job titles correct when you're posting the job? Are they meaningful? Do your credentials look correct, right? When you're posting a job description, you need to put meaningful credentials that are correct for the job, but also narrow enough for the particulars of the job, right? Don't go too vague. And so on this issue of hiring, Paul or Aisha, do either of you have any other examples of maybe things to look out for or things to think about when you're looking at a hiring pool?
Yeah, I'll jump in first. I think that last point you made is really important. Certainly in the government contractor area, our job recs are largely tied to LCATs. Sometimes they're not, but they largely are, and they're tied to the government contract, which says anybody for this particular job has to have 10 years of experience, an advanced degree, and other type qualifications. I'd encourage contractors who are out there, at least early on in the process, when you're talking with the government client, it is okay to say, do you really need this? Do you really need somebody with 10 years, or will 6 years suffice? Because we have certainly seen, and I know that other government contractors have seen, that when your job rec doesn't align properly with the job for whatever reason, right? The applicant pool is going to be off. It's not going to be as robust or frankly as narrow as you want it. And internally for some positions that we have that aren't related to LCATs, we're scrubbing the job rec to see, does this make sense? And frankly, are we willing to maybe take somebody who has a little bit less experience and invest in them to, train them up how we want, people to work at Leidos and so on and so forth. So there are lots of opportunities, and it starts with the conversation that recruiting has with the manager. What do they really need? What are they really looking for? Because you don't want to foreclose people that would do really well in the job through requirements that may or may not be necessary. I mean, that question about the temperature is mind-boggling, right? One seemingly innocuous question can really torpedo your efforts here. So I think thinking through your hiring process and everything that goes into it, especially on the job rec or the job advertisement, because you're trying to attract a lot of people, a lot of qualified people, and then you can make the best decisions from there, assuming that the pipeline is big enough.
So I would just add that in this time of kind of the Great Resignation, there's just such tremendous pressure on the recruiters to get people in and get people in fast. And so I'd love to say that they take their time in refreshing every requisition, every job posting that gets put up there. But I would say one of the things that I always feel passionate about is if you fish in the same pond, you're always going to pull the same kinds of fish. And so being open to different kinds of organizations, like one of the things that I used to bristle at in the context of technology recruiting is, the leaders would always say, just in tech generally, you just don't find a lot of women and minorities. So is that the end of our story? Is that where we stop? Because it's hard. Okay, well, it's hard. And one of the ways that you can help with that is, are you out there developing strategic relationships with different kinds of organizations that actually pull those kinds of folks, like whether it be at the college level, professional organizations, so that, are you reaching out to women in tech or Black girls who code or any of those kinds of organizations, and being committed to feeding and watering and developing. In the short term, there are a whole host of organizations, and I've had to fight this battle even internally with our folks recruiting for legal, different kinds of organizations for women and minorities, so that you can get more applicants, because those folks are going to those places. And so, again, expanding the ponds that you are fishing in to pull different kinds of fish, and that helps to bring in more folks, even when you have to do it with speed, just because I know that the pressure, because, as a hiring manager, I want my new person fast. Right. And so they're trying to respond to that. But when you put your chips in different places, I think that can also help on that front end part.
Absolutely. Brilliant points. So many things to think about. And again, it's that, just to circle back to the beginning of the conversation, right? It's that deeper dive stuff, not the surface level. What's the quick answer I want here? But where can I make meaningful change in lower level things that aren't as easy to see to get us to a better posture. So the next point, I know we don't have too much time left, so I have to go, quickly through this one. I could spend days talking on the issue of compensation, right? For a lot of businesses, DEI and compensation and the intersection thereof, I think it's a hot spot for virtually every business, and I think it's going to, ratchet up as time goes on. And a couple of quick things, because I don't have a lot of time here. If you are looking at comp, please work with counsel to do it under privilege where you can. My federal contractor friends, you may also know there's a new OFCCP directive. You have other considerations. Again, work on that with your AAP vendor or whatever you're doing for your AAPs. But as a general rule, make sure you're doing these things from a meaningful review, generally speaking, directed by your counsel, and not just running willy-nilly reports. And I can tell you, comp data, we've spent a lot of time today talking about how difficult it is to get your hands around hiring data, make sure your hiring data is accurate. Comp is astronomically more difficult to analyze correctly, to get your hands on just the right data, and so on and so forth. So a couple of quick points, if you're running, compensation, make sure you're looking, again, this is where counsel or a labor economist can really help you clean that data, right? We shouldn't be seeing people. I just got a data set from a client recently. It's got all kinds of people who are showing their wages below minimum wage. I know that's not right. I know it's inaccurate. It's just the data pool was incorrect. Or people that are showing up as zeros, right? Maybe your data is just got some problems in the way it was pulled. The other thing is make sure you're comparing apples to apples, right? If Lauren was hired in September in the same job as John, you don't want to compare, our actual wages earned, right? You want to compare annualized comparison, right? So maybe that's probably my hourly rate times 2080, and the same thing for him. So you're comparing apples to apples and not throwing your own data for a loop by putting something that's not meaningful or valid. So think about all those types of things. And again, we could spend all day on this intersection of DEI and compensation. To me, this is where I see the biggest opportunities for you all. It's the area that has gotten some of the least attention internally in organizations. It's difficult to get your hands around, and I think that frustrates, business folks, that it can be very difficult. They want these quick, easy answers. Obviously, they like answers that cost less. And so I just want to highlight, you have a lot of opportunities here. And please hear me when I say, oh, I'm sorry, I want to go back to this slide very quickly. This is the future, right? Data transparency is coming culturally, and Aisha and Paul probably have a lot of inputs on this as well, but culturally speaking, this is where we are moving. It just is. This is, to Aisha's point, the cultural moves that we've made over the last couple of years. I'm highlighting on this slide here, if you can see this gender pay gap bot, which I love. It's on Twitter. It's fascinating, right? In the UK, the companies have to file this gap report annually. They're taking that data, and let me assure you, this one I pulled from an organization that is massive, has huge name recognition, and that everyone on this call would certainly recognize. And they put them on blast, like, hey, we see that you're tweeting out about International Women's Day, but in your organization, the median hourly pay is 36.8% lower than men's. This is the future. This naming and shaming and transparency and data is coming. How prepared is your organization for it when it does? And Paul and Aisha, to give you a quick minute to add any inputs here on comp, because I know we're running out of time.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. One thing I would add, if you haven't started looking at your compensation data, start looking at it, because you'll be able to figure out what you need and what you're missing in order to start collecting additional data if you need to, in order to run a meaningful analysis. But what I would think, this is kind of a takeaway I have really for employment law in general, and especially when it comes to compensation, but stop, think, and justify. Whatever you're doing, stop, think, and justify it. If you're giving somebody a raise who's performing just as well as somebody else, why are you not giving that other person a raise as well? So, like I said, just stop, think, and justify with everything that pops up in employment law.
Aisha, do you want to give some highlights, because I know we're out of time, on the concept of sharing and the thoughts to consider there?
Yeah, just as quickly as I can. There's a lot of interest from all of these groups here in terms of share that, give me the data, give me the data, give me the data. And again, going back to an earlier comment, the arc that we've been on, we're not as far as some companies, but we're more in the place of sharing some key things. So out on our publicly available website, we share our high level representation stats for women and minorities. I will say when we started, we probably aggregated our underrepresented groups, and now we're at the process where we're breaking those out more, because we feel more comfortable that the numbers are what they are. And, there's a time you take the hit for it, and then you really work hard to show the improvement. I would say with DE&I personnel, again, I work very closely with that group. So we do things, we're really going to do a deep dive under a charging memo to make an attempt to really protect the privilege. It's really critical that your internal partners understand the difference from performing operational functions that will not be privileged versus analyses that are being conducted for the purposes of providing legal advice. It's a source of frustration for the internal folks sometimes, but they just have to get over it until we're at a point where we say, we don't care. And so sometimes there's natural tension between HR and legal, in terms of we want transparency. And it's like transparency comes at a cost. And so you need to know where you are in your organization. That will help drive the nature of your transparency. And I think when you really get to evolve, initially, we've been making statements like, hey, we've achieved pay equity for this period of time. And our teammates will say, show us. And we'll be like, yeah, no, not like that. But now we're at the point where we're doing an analysis that's not privileged, where we will be able to say, women and underrepresented minorities make X on the dollar as do white males or things like that. And so again, evolutionary process, try to hold the line on the privilege until you get to the point organizationally where you're willing to kind of take the hit for some of the numbers, and just make sure that you stay connected with those groups that have access from an operational perspective to make sure they don't go wild.
That's right. Numbers are only meaningful if they're meaningful, right? Running junk numbers or bad data or bad analyses will not help you and will create problems. And then especially for my legal counsel friends on the phone, but to everyone, know what your systems are doing, right? Are they storing the data? How are they storing it? Who has access? How long are you storing it for? Does your system, a lot of the new systems have a lot of bells and whistles that are attractive to people, like, but maybe legal doesn't realize, because there's a very, very popular ATS/HRIS that allows you to search by race, sex of your employees, things like that, unless you disable that functionality. There's also systems out there that will add on a pay equity button so that anyone in HR can go, push a pay equity button. Things like that you want to be really careful about. And we don't have time to get into it today, but be careful about sharing your data with AI vendors or other recruiting and outreach vendors, because your data can maybe be used to be an input in another algorithm or causing and perpetuating certain types of problems at your organization or a different organization. So it's important to keep your hands around where's my data going and who's using it for what. And I think, unfortunately, I believe we are out of time.
Yes, thank you, Lauren. Thanks so much to the whole panel for such an interesting and enlightening discussion. At this point, it's time to conclude the session. On behalf of our chapter, I'd like to just give a special thanks to our sponsor, Ogletree, and to our panelists, Lauren Hicks, Aisha Massengale, and Paul Keogh. We'll be taking another break now, but if you have a question and would like to speak to the panel directly, feel free to remain here and take yourself off mute, and you can ask your question. Thank you so much again, and we'll begin the next session at 10:25. Thank you.
Shannon. We will now transition to our second session of the day. We are pleased that our sponsor, Buchanan, Ingersoll & Rooney, will join us for a discussion on getting DEI into the DNA. For those who have joined us later in the day, I am Sharifa Balagoon, Chief Legal and Compliance Counsel at CQ Credit Union and co-chair of the ACC NCR DEI Programming Subcommittee. I will serve as the chapter's host for this session. As a reminder, if you have a question during the session, please use the chat box at the bottom of your screen. The panel will address your questions as time permits. Once again, all remarks made by today's panelists are their own opinions and do not constitute legal advice or necessarily reflect the viewpoints of their company or firm or of ACC National Capital Region. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our panel for today's presentation. As Buchanan's Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, Lloyd Freeman is responsible for advancing and expanding diversity throughout the firm and across the legal industry as a whole. Lloyd develops and drives the firm's diversity initiatives related to attorney hiring, retention, and advancement. He oversees the firm's affinity groups and promotes mentorship and sponsorship as key retention initiatives. Additionally, he collaborates with Buchanan's clients to meet and advance their diversity and inclusion goals and coordinates partnerships for mutually beneficial programs such as internships, thought leadership, speaking engagements, and more. Lloyd is also involved in nurturing key partnerships to drive strategic diversity and inclusion marketing, as well as business development initiatives. Lloyd has been a champion of diversity and inclusion in the legal profession throughout his career. Dr. Timothy Fear is Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Burlington Stores Incorporated. In this role, he is charged with embedding and infusing a comprehensive and coordinating diversity agenda amongst the organization's corporate, merchandising, and distribution centers. Before joining Burlington, he served as the inaugural Vice Chancellor for Diversity and Inclusion at the LSU Health Sciences Center in New Orleans. In this role, he works to define and strategically align institutional diversity efforts and to develop cultural competence skills in students, faculty, and staff. Gina Pemberton is Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at Omnicom Health Group. In this role, she is responsible for developing and driving forward the diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy for the network of agencies. She joined OHDG in October of 2020. Previously, she spent 13 years at Johnson & Johnson, where she held various corporate finance roles. Most recently, she was the Director, Finance Leadership Development Programs and Finance Recruiting. Prior to that, she was with Motorola for 8 years. She is also a dedicated volunteer and is currently serving as the president for the National Hampton Alumni Association, Inc. since 2018. Prior to becoming the president of the NHAA, she served as the North Atlantic Regional President for 4 years. With that, let's begin today's presentation.
And we are not going to hold that Hampton stuff against Gina during this conversation. I waited to give her that so I knew we were live and we were recording.
Right.
Thank you, Sharifa, for the intro. We're going to have fun because I know that, oftentimes when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I mean, it's heavy stuff. And we're talking about issues around change management. We're talking about what can sometimes be deemed as the impossible, how you can get your organization to turn a corner. But I do think that if you can infuse some levity and a bit of realness in there, it makes it just that much easier. So thank you all for having us. We appreciate this platform with the ACC, and very much so because of kind of where we are as a country, and I'm sure with all of our organizations along our DEI journey. There's often been, of course, criticism that we face, and so the criticism is, how performative is diversity and inclusion within an organization? And when are we going to go beyond the surface? And what I mean by that is, observing Black History Month, right? And starting a book club and, starting to have some very discrete programs and initiatives like that. And when are we really going to go a bit deeper? And so that's why I believe that really embedding DEI in the DNA of an organization is such a great and timely topic. And I think that policy is truly where it's at. And so I'm going to start the conversation off with Timothy, just to kind of level set. Why is it so important for us to have DEI policies in an organization?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me today. I'm quite thrilled and honored to be here. When I think about the importance of policies, DEI policies in an organization, I really think it's critical, number one, because it allows an organization to have more than a rhetorical commitment to diversity and inclusion. One of the things that we've seen directly after the social unrest and upheaval that happened in the summer of 2020, we've seen a lot of folks release statements. A lot of folks had a rhetorical ethical commitment that they wanted to make, a stance they wanted to make around the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's great, that's beautiful, but policies allow us really to codify that commitment. It allows us to really put some weight behind the things that we say. And so oftentimes we've probably heard the mantra, what gets measured gets done. I like to abbreviate that and amend it and say, what gets measured and managed gets done. Mm-hmm. And when we create diversity policies, equity and inclusion policies organizationally, we provide some strategic scaffolding to manage the work of diversity and inclusion. And so, it's great as a diversity officer for me to be able to talk about the organization's commitment, specifically, for example, if I'm dealing with a compliance issue or dealing with an issue that we may have to sever relationships with an individual. It's great to have that conversation from an ethical perspective. It's another really weightier matter if I'm able to say, and here are the policies that were breached, right? Here are the ways in which you have not adhered to our organizational standards as mentioned in this particular policy. So, it allows us to have some level of accountability, some level of equity, but it also gives people something to look up to and something to adhere to. So organizational policies and diversity and inclusion not only keep us from being variance or having variance rather in the way that we distribute the decisions that we make, but it also allows us really to, again, have some weight behind our commitment.
Yeah, and I feel like it pulls D&I out of this silo that sits over here by itself. Again, it's kind of a wonderful, cute add-on that you can put to HR, an add-on that you can bring to business development or to marketing, but rather it's actually a part of the actual organization. And so, Gina, in your own words, then why is it so important for us to have these policies? Because I know that, of course, it varies, between industries, the kinds of policies that you enact, but I can imagine that generally speaking, the purpose behind why you do it remains the same. But I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree with your earlier statement that was around it being a part of the DNA. And I think in order for it to truly be a part of the DNA, there has to be policies that are associated with it, right? Because like Dr. Fair said, there's no accountability if anything goes awry, if there's anything, I as you heard, I have a finance background. So when I came into this role, I was really about metrics, right? And you can't have metrics and hold people accountable if you don't have a policy associated with it. And for me, how can we really drive any real change without being able to land on something such as a policy or different policies in order to drive that forward? And so, when I came into my role, it was the first of its kind. It was kind of the evolving roles that came out after the social unrest of 2020. And I was lucky enough that my CEO was very much driven on, here's what we need to do to make this change, which enabled me to be able to put in place various policies and drive and do the measurement of metrics and drive them towards different goals that are related to it. So I don't think we would have made any impact if it hadn't been for those policies, the metrics, and of course, our CEO not being performative.
Yeah, and I want to make sure that I'm being fair to the folks who either do not have, a diversity professional practitioner, in their organization, or they're not yet in their D&I journey where they are, enacting policy. I'm not saying that there cannot be any change without policy. We're talking about sustainable change. And so we're talking about, perhaps long after Lloyd is gone from the organization or Timothy is gone and has transitioned over, there's new leadership over in Gina's organization, that policy is going to remain. And so, whatever it is that we did, if only for a moment while those individuals are there, that can be ephemeral. We want something that's going to have a long lasting effect on the organization. Now, I will tell you though, kind of when everyone, as Timothy was mentioning in the beginning, everyone put out those statements, in 2020, and they were talking about, diversity, equity, and inclusion is absolutely embedded within, the ethos of our organization. I mean, it is woven throughout the fabric of everything that we do. I mean, we can almost kind of like recite these from memory now, right? So I'm going to start with you then, Gina, because you're already laughing at me, but distinguish, actual DE&I policy in and of itself from embedding DE&I, within your existing organization policies. And so what I'm talking about is, the importance of having D&I policy that comes from the office of the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer versus, the add-on, if you will. And so I just want to make sure that we kind of highlight that for a moment. Can you start by distinguishing that? And then I want to come over and get your thoughts, Timothy.
Yeah, so I think the best way for me to kind of showcase that is maybe share an example from my world of DEI. And it's when, so like I said, when I came into the role, I'll explain Omnicom Health Group real quick. It is a network of advertising agencies focused in on healthcare advertising and communication. So there are 35 different agencies that fall into the network. So all of the 35 networks or agencies have CEOs, et cetera, and their own staff. When I came in, maybe 15 of them were doing some sort of D&I embedded into the fabric of our lives, as you stated, Lloyd. And so I think, I was like, oh, great, let's find out what that was. And what it really meant was they maybe brought in a speaker to train them on unconscious bias, or perhaps they had a group of employees that were kind of celebrating Women's History Month, or doing something like that. And so I quickly realized, oh, that's what we're talking about. And so that kind of drove me down a path of, we need to build out a full one strategy, and then what are the policies I'm going to push through across the network. And one of the things in our strategy was around driving education, so that everyone was in the same place of understanding of what DEI was, where we're going. And so we built a whole training program, but the policy that I built it was mandatory by all 100% of our employees. So there was no in, there was no out. Our CEO was aligned, our general counsel was aligned. It was going to be treated just as equally as our sexual harassment training or our IT training. And we were very clear that this was the policy. You do this training or you have the repercussions as it relates to it, right? And so that training had unconscious bias, it had anti-racism, it had D&I for managers, it had all of these things. And what we started to learn is, some people were like, oh, we've already taken this training. But then when they took it, they were like, oh, we didn't really take a training. It started to come out, people were coming back and saying, oh, this is totally different than what we expected. And what we're starting to see now, a year and a half later, after the training's done, is people are starting to ingrain what they're learned into the culture of their work, as opposed to, I just sat in a training with this one person and I checked the box and now I'm out, right? Now they're like, oh, I'm now utilizing this in the work that we're building.
Yes, I've even begun to reframe, the way in which we refer to, those workshops, because I do understand that people even coming into the space thinking that it's a check the box. I mean, you kind of already lost them. And so I don't even refer to it as training anymore. You get trained on how to use the phone or how to save a document to the system. This is education. And so education is ongoing. You can always learn some more. And don't think that this is the only time you're going to be subjected to sitting down and listening to, what is going on in the D&I world. And so everyone in my organization refers to it as education. But Timothy, I do see you nodding your head there. Just trying to find out if we can really elucidate for our attendees, some distinctions between DE&I policy in and of itself and embedding DEI within the organization.
Certainly. And I was quite compelled by Gina's comments and the sort of case study she mentioned. So I'm going to give a case study as well. So at a former organization that I was at, when I first got to the organization, one of the things I asked was exactly that, right? What are the distinctions between the organization's diversity policies and broad policies, right? Like how do they interplay? So one of the things I developed was what I called a DEI audit. That was for us to look at every policy, look at all of the programs, initiatives, look at all of the hiring practices, and ask the question so in this case, controlling for policies, to whom does this policy greatly benefit? To whom does this policy does not benefit at all, right? And anywhere on that continuum, how might we ensure that our policies are not adversely impacting certain segmented populations within our organization? So I created this whole assessment, walked all of our executive leaders through this particular exercise. And one of the things that we learned very early and up front was that there were efforts, right? When we take, for example, what was a maternal leave policy, right? That greatly adversely impacted a certain population in our organization. So asking that question and getting leaders to have to grapple with that, I think really warmed the path for me to say, okay, by virtue of the things that have come out from this assessment, here are the policies that are needed. And quite frankly, and I think I shared this earlier in an earlier conversation with Lloyd and Gina, many times our sort of organizational policies, when folks say diversity, equity, and inclusion is embedded throughout our organization, that is a fantastic, I'm a bibliophile. I love words, right? That's a beautiful way of describing diversity in an organization. But I suspect that sometimes it's used as a euphemism for us not getting any appreciable change out of leadership. that we're going to centralize diversity in this office. And by virtue of that, it'll be embedded in all that we do. So don't expect us to do any more than embedded into what we're doing. When we do an audit, right, when we hold leaders accountable for appreciable results, what gets, going back to that comment I made earlier, what gets measured and managed gets done. And so it was very apparent that we needed to do some things organizationally by virtue of the fact that we know it would be unfair of us to sit with the results of this assessment and not do anything. And so that's one of the things I would offer, is that both can work together. Yes, diversity, equity, and inclusion ought to be threaded throughout the fabric of an organization, but if it's going to be decidedly and appreciably distinct, then we have to ensure that we're doing things that are just as distinct as we would any other finance policy or HR policy. And so being able to work in tandem, I think, is critically important.
I wholeheartedly agree with everything except for the bibliophiles. I don't know anything about that, but I am a foodie. And so the way in which I look at it is, you know, when people say, oh yeah, we put diversity into everything we do, that's like putting a little pepper on top of all your food. I want to put a little salt on it, you know, just so I can like, oh yeah, wait, these potatoes are okay. Let's add a little bit of salt and pepper on it. No. Diversity has to be on the menu. I mean, It has to be a part of something that we are actually consuming. Otherwise, you know, you could decide to do without it. And it cannot be the afterthought. It cannot be, you know what, we were going to go ahead and put together the parental leave policy. Oh yeah, has anybody run this by Gina? That's not how we do things. You know, we don't enact any other policies and kind of as an afterthought say, oh my gosh, has anybody checked to see if we can afford this? You know, other departments within your organization would have a fit if that was the case. And so I then believe that is, of course, what is, you know, such the joy in having folks who are in our roles within these organizations, is that, you know, we understand that this is our job. And so, you know, you very much so want to be effective in that role. Is it an expectation, though, Timothy, for you or others within your organization to propose or refresh the organization policies? And if it's not a part of your job description or someone's job description, should it be?
Yeah, so one of the things that I'm quite proud of at Burlington is that one, there is so much more than a rhetorical commitment. It was very clear to me, even I've been there 12 or 13 weeks, so I'm still a baby in the organization. But even during my onboarding process, certainly during the recruitment process, I noticed that the organization really was honest with itself about the things that they wanted to do better. They knew what they didn't know. And that, quite frankly, is refreshing as a diversity practitioner and an executive in this work, to have an organization who knows that we want to do better. We don't necessarily have all the tools, which is why we're bringing folks on. And by virtue of that, they said to us early on, hey, we know that there are policies that could be refined. We know that there's work that can be done that can enhance our organization. And by virtue of knowing that, we want to bring in that expert knowledge and to draw on the knowledge reservoir of these executives. And so it is explicitly stated in the work that I am supposed to be doing. I will absolutely be evaluated on it. And it's work that I think is going to help not only the organization broadly, but locally. So we're thinking not just broadly. And that's an important perspective. I think that we ought to have organizational policies that are broad, but thinking about the policies and the practices in localized environments as well. Yes. And so I am delighted to be marrying our work. We're currently going through what we call Burlington 2.0, which is a new strategic plan. I encourage anyone who's interested in it to read about it online. And that's my little plug for Burlington. But I also recognize that was an opportunity for us to ask ourselves the question, in this new strategic plan, in the direction that we're moving organizationally, what are the policies that will help get us there? What are the DEI policies, practices, and protocols and that will help us there? Exactly. So I offer that to say it's critically important to find those pockets and opportunities. Sometimes it's a strategic plan. Sometimes, unfortunately, which is what we've seen in 2020, sometimes it's a crisis. But what is the window of opportunity that you have to create, embed, infuse, modify, and refine policies organizationally around this work? And so whatever that window is, know that that window is there, know when it is there, because those windows have a way of closing. Again, 2020 was a wonderful year for the work of DEI. It was a terrible year for race relations and all of that, but it was a window of opportunity. If if you're like me, many of my CDO colleagues and I laugh often because that window's closed, right? So like the leg room that we had, the runway that we had with respect to this work, being able to accelerate it has closed. There will be other windows, right? If it's a strategic plan, if it's a new leader on board, whatever that window is, being able to utilize it in a way that is constructive and strategic to move the organization forward, I think that's very important.
I want to stay with that piece before I come over to you, Gina, which is, each of these individuals who are, in leadership within the organization. I mean, you are charged generally with moving the organization forward. And so that's why I ask you then, Gina, aren't you seeing others in the C-suite who are very much so principally responsible for being drivers of policy, whether it is enacting new policy or refreshing, amending policy? And so also, should it also be the case that it's an expectation for others who have your title within their various organizations to be doing the exact same thing?
Yeah, no, I don't think this work can be done without other people that don't have this title being held accountable and pushing these policies through everywhere. I mean, like I described, I have 35 different CEOs. There's only one Gina, right? So in order for this to really carry through, I mean, as awesome as I am, the only way to get this to move forward is with the work and the support of those leaders, right? And if those leaders are not about it, then we have a problem, right? And that starts to show. But as long as they're aligned and working together and open to driving that change, then yeah, to me, that's the only way that we can make any real change. Because while there was an influx in the world of DEI, it wasn't big enough for us to really drive and make sure there was one of us at every place, right? And as much as it has increased, there's still people that are like, what is it? What are you doing again? What is that job that you have? Or
and where are you on the P&L?
Right.
Because I don't see, you're not helping us sell widgets. So
Right.
Where are you and how important are you? I
Right.
know it.
Yeah, exactly. And especially in my world of advertising, right, which is all about billable time to clients, right? They're like, what's she doing over there except for making us lose more billable time? Except for now, our clients are very much driven to make a change in DEI. And I think that's where I start to get more of the leader buy-in, is because now our clients are starting to say, hey, what is it that you all are doing as it relates to this space? And how can we connect? And so what does that mean? Oh, they got to call Gina and be like, can you help us answer this or come into these meetings, et cetera. So it's slow moving, but there is a shift, but it only can happen if other people are involved.
Oh, very much so. I mean, bringing it back to, of course, the folks who are attending this session. And so in the legal space, absolutely, our clients have been the drivers of that change. And so I love, the fact that sometimes the question is asked, oh, what are you doing? But other times there's no question mark on the end. This is what you need to be doing in order for you to either earn or keep our business.
Absolutely.
Period. Hard stop. That's it. I mean, and ask us about the policies. I mean, this is literally my plea, to all of you who are, in these in-house legal departments. Ask us about our policy. Do you have a policy that speaks to this? Because to the extent that you have some organizations who have not empowered whomever their D&I officer or D&I practitioners are to be able to effectuate policy, they certainly will once our clients and once these external stakeholders begin to start asking those questions. So that's my own little plug to continue to challenge us. But, there is no playbook yet. And so, Timothy, we are very much so understanding that we are at we're still hanging on to some of that momentum from 2020, but we're still in the ideation phase. A lot of organizations, again, kind of on that D&I journey. How do you ideate around potential DEI policy, and not just within your organization, but generally for all of our attendees? What are some best practices? Is it utilizing a D&I committee or kind of consulting with those stakeholders, how I mentioned before, going to the clients, the external stakeholders, and finding out, what they're doing? Is it looking at your peers? What is your approach? What are some best practices? I'm going to go start with Timothy and then come over to you, Gina.
Sure, I would say both ends. So utilizing the infrastructure that you have organizationally, One of the things that at my current organization that we're proud of is that we're building out a multi-tiered governance structure around DEI, which allows us to hear from multiple forms or multiple types of roles and ranks in the organization, multiple communities. And being able to leverage those voices really helps us to move our organization forward authentically. It's one thing for me to say, here's a great idea that I have. It's another thing to say, in speaking to 3 of the 5 governance groups that we have within our organization, here are the things that have come up as top of mind. So being able to have that baked into the organizational practice, I think is critical when it comes to DEI. But of course, as a student and a scholar of the work, I'm constantly looking and benchmarking, specifically at Burlington, right? Our competitors or similarly situated organizations and our peers to think about, okay, what is going on that is top of mind for these organizations? Are there innovative practices that are emerging from these particular kinds of roles and organizations as well? Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the research, as an academician, right? This is the first role that I had outside of the academy. It is always important for me to be mindful of where we're going from a trend research-based perspective. So utilizing that data to be able to make data-driven decisions as well. And so this universe of ideas that are constantly, there's a confluence of it, that are constantly moving, I think really helps us to have more comprehensive sort of information gathering as we make these decisions. So, you know, within every organization, especially in executive leadership, I recognize that everyone's lever for what makes them move is different, right? So not everyone's going to be compelled by the data that emerges from our governance groups. Some people are going to be compelled by, here's the bottom line that is also critically important. But when you got a universe that you can pull from, it really allows you to.
Love that. Love that. Gina, as I come to you, then are you also talking to your employees, finding out what are the policies they would like for you to have within your organization? Are you chatting with others in executive leadership to try to find out perhaps, kind of from that cross-functional aspect of your job, whether there are policies that, can come again out of the office of the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer that could be able to help the way in which we source talent, the way in which we retain talent, et cetera?
Nope, I just do whatever I want. No,
there's that approach too.
Could you imagine? I'm working with all types of groups. When I came in, I built out what I call a DEI advisory board because I was coming into a new space of advertising. And one, I could have all the ideas I want, but they may not apply in the world that we're working in. And without me having, I needed a team that could give me, the right kind of feedback and share their ideas as well. So those are, in essence, senior leaders across all of those agencies that I talked about that sit on the DEI advisory board. And then I created a DEI council, which is actually kind of a compilation of all those people that I talked about that were leading like a D&I group in each of their agencies, bringing the employees together. So then I get kind of more of the voice of the people in that regard. And then we have a few employee resource groups. And because we have those employee resource groups, I have the group of the leaders of each of those groups as an ERG council. So then I get a voice of the different communities as well. So we have a Black collective, we have a Unidos, it's our Latinx community, and then we have a API group, and then we have an ally ERG. So then I get all of the voices of those for right now. And we're still building out more ERGs, but yeah, I utilize everybody. And I also have made a point of making myself accessible. So where I can, I jump into different meetings or, we utilize Teams chats a lot. Sometimes I'll jump in there if I see some, and say, reach out if you need anything, or if there are people that have comments or what have you. I've been very much trying to make myself someone that's accessible, so that if employees do want to speak on anything that maybe they don't want to talk to HR or talk to their boss about, that they can come to me. And so that's been working as well. And I've been able to get a little bit more of the lay of the land from different people in that regards.
And I've even found that you can get more, here's my plug for the hybrid work environment. I've been able to actually get a bit more candor from speaking to employees in that regard about what can we do to improve, your experience here with us, what can we do to make the culture better, because people are in the comfort of their home, there's not the thin walls and the person next door, or certainly when I walk into someone's office, everybody's like, Timothy's in trouble. He must have said something. Lloyd's coming to see him. It's not always disciplinary. It's really around, trying to do that fact gathering, as you mentioned. And so I think this is great. And I love the fact that, in the chat, I asked, some of these folks who are in these corporate legal departments, what are you asking some of your vendors, lawyers and even outside of your outside counsel. But I also charge you to go into some of the things that Gina mentioned. Do you have a D&I committee or council? Do you have those ERGs or affinity groups? Make sure that you're not just asking about whether they have the person in the role, but that they also have the policies and that they also are giving those individuals the support and the infrastructure they need to really be effective in those positions. So I want to transition a bit and start talking about the actual meat and potatoes. How do we actually create this policy? And I know that there are a number of approaches to this, but Timothy, I know when we were chatting around having this program today, we spoke about, some of your theories and ways in which you approach it. You want to create a policy in a way that actually gets to the root of the issue. We don't want something that only solves half the problem, right? Timothy, you have this interesting approach around inclusive integrity. And I really want to give you a moment to chat a bit about your thoughts in that regard and how others can be able to utilize it within their organizations.
Definitely. So I'll share the broad and encompassing version of inclusive integrity, because I think it's some key learnings in it. So I've come up with a concept that is called inclusive integrity, which really focuses on keeping morality in our work as DEI practitioners. That so often, the work of diversity is now a euphemism for a whole host of things, but inclusive integrity really compels organizations to really be mindful about doing what is right for others, even in those moments where it's not right for ourselves, right? Like even when the organization has to pay a price that they're not used to or not necessarily even comfortable with, but paying that price, knowing that we are doing what is right for others. So it's really this outwardly facing theory that we are going to ensure that organizationally, even though this may not be expedient for us, but even though it may be an equity policy, which means that it could disproportionately impact a population who has been adversely impacted at one point, right? We're going to do what is right because we recognize that there has been a disparity or a deficit there. And so I do this through what I call an inclusive yet differentiated lens. Here's how I create diversity policy. Diversity policies, in my mind, everyone is under this tent, right? Our organizations, if we think about them as tents, everyone's under a tent. But there will be moments in times where we need to pay a particular attention to a particular population underneath that tent. I worked in universities for a while, and so we often did it when we had conversations about, for example, women in STEM. We recognize that historically, women have not had the same level of access and equity in STEM. So we created policies that would intentionally focus on this population to ensure that there was a level of equity there. So I use that same level of intention with respect to various different other populations. So in every organization, there are people who have variances in outcomes, access, and success. And when you see those distinctions, the question is, what am I going to do with that, right? My contention is that we ought to create targeted, while we have inclusive policies that impact our organizations broadly, when we recognize that there are particular examples of distinct populations who are not doing as equitably as others, or their access or success is not as equitably as others, then we're going to create those policies that will bring them to a level of parity, even when it means we're going about it in a way that costs us something. It's going to cost us attention. It's going to cost us bandwidth. Many times it's going to cost us resources. But this is what the work of diversity is about. And I've shared with every leader that I've had, I am here not to be liked. I really am not. I really like friends. I do. I love them. But I recognize that there's a part of this job that at some point, if I do it correctly, someone's not going to like me. And so,
but wait, and I hate to interrupt you, but that's not just for the folks in D&I, because don't forget, again, I always liken it to the finances. And if the CFO is everyone's friend, that means that everyone's just got a corporate card and everyone's just going to Capital Grill and having a wonderful old time and having these great lunches. You've got to have something that really brings us back to, what our goals are within this organization. So we have to be fiscally conservative at times. We've got to have, some D&I policy that very much so challenges us and challenges the way in which we've, quote, always done it. So absolutely understand. No, please continue, because I need to hear this. You don't have to be their friend.
I think that's critical. You summed it up very greatly there. One of the things I shared often in jest, but I believe this to be inherently true, is that diversity, equity, and inclusion is probably the only organizational function where people, regardless of where they are in the organization, feel like they are an expert in it, right? All of us have identities. So by virtue of that, we're DEI experts. That we forget about the competency-based work that is required to be an effective DEI officer. We think that by virtue of having an opinion, we can be an expert. No one's saying, here are the finance policies that we need to make to the CFO. No one is offering them emails about suggestions. And I'm not offering that DEI officers are above reproach. What I am offering is that there should be some level of organizational trust that's given to the DEI practitioner. We brought you in for a reason. Give those DEI officers, or the people who are charged of doing that work, give them the trust and the requisite timeline to do the work that they need to be effective. And so when I think about, again, inclusive integrity and inclusive yet differentiated policies, it is absolutely saying we are going to be unapologetically focused on certain populations. And as the business needs, as society, as our representation changes, we will modify, we will approach this dynamically, but we recognize that within our organization, there are people who are not achieving as equitably or having the same level of success or access. And so we're going to do things that are unapologetically focused on them, regardless of the temperament of society.
Mm-hmm. Well, and a lot of times I'm sure you can glean that from, doing the audit, so kind of circling back to what you opened up with, you got to go in there and you got to, open up all the cabinets and find out, what we got going on here in the cupboards in order for you to find out, okay, now we know where we've got to go when we start to put this policy into place. Now, one of our attendees mentioned that, this is wonderful. And we're now talking about how perhaps there are some demographics within the organization that are not necessarily being represented or being served in the most equitable fashion. But then how do you focus on measurement and those metrics without veering into some of the risks? And again, some of them, maybe even having a legal undertone. But for instance, some of your hiring managers feeling pressured into, hiring a candidate who comes, a person of color or from another underrepresented group. Gina, I'm going to come to you. I mean, I'm going to start it off by saying I really talk to the folks in my organization around intentionality, not around quota. I'm never going to tell you that, we must hire Gina because Gina is a woman and we need more women. That's not it. It's really around the intentionality. Where are we sourcing that talent? What do our hiring panels look like? What are the questions that we are asking them? What do the evaluations look like from those people who are doing our interviews? I mean, that to me, and then of course, what that candidate pool looks like. So before we make a decision, who is it that we canvassed? Who is it that we actually looked at? Because I think that oftentimes my job is to ask not only the why, but why not? Not only why did we interview this group, but why did we not go and interview Gina for that? Why didn't we consider someone internally for that particular role? That's the way in which I approach the folks in my team and in my organization. Gina, what about you? How do you make sure that you still give people ownership of things like, hiring, but you don't run afoul of kind of telling them these are your mandates as to what you must do?
Yeah, I think very similarly to you, Lloyd, I do talk a lot about, where are we sourcing from, right? Hiring managers, look at who they get, right? And so if our talent acquisition team and our recruiting team is just sending them the same demographic over and over and over again, then they're going to keep hiring the same demographic. So I put a lot of my push and drive into the recruiters and saying, hey, let's talk about where you're sourcing from. Where are you pulling this talent from? And let's start to provide a more diverse slate to those hiring managers so that they're in a place where they can make a decision. Because like you, I'm never going to say the mandate is we've got to hire 2% more Latinx people and do it by, any ways, any means necessary. That's not going to come out of my mouth. However, I will talk to the recruiting team and say, we need to make sure that our slate of candidates are diverse. So, gender diverse, racially diverse, thought diverse, because a lot of times people like to recruit the same people and went to the same colleges, et cetera, all of that, right? And so that's where we've been driving a lot of, where I've been driving a lot of change and trying to drive a new conversation. And what's been most interesting is the recruiters have all been like, we've been wanting to do this, but nobody is really, told us, where to go, what to do, or said, go for it, right? And, I think the other thing that I've been doing is then on the other end, because I'm a metric space, right? And I love my numbers, is I'm measuring each of the CEOs every month on their new hire, or I'm showcasing their new hire diversity every month. So
you're measuring it. You're telling them you're showcasing it, but you're measuring it.
Absolutely, I'm measuring it. So, because then at the end of the year, I can be like, dear sir, how is it that you have not hired one diverse employee in an entire year? That can't be possible in the United States of America. That's it, right? We're not doing some special role. There's no work here that says that you can't find a diverse employee at any level, right? So I'm only measuring it across the board. And so what that has begun to do is made the leaders hold their teams accountable to making sure that they are looking at diverse slates and opportunities for diverse employees. So I'm hitting them from both sides, right? So I'm going to go to the recruiters, talking to that team and helping them figure out where they can source talent. And then I'm on the other end and I'm saying, look at what I'm also showcasing those people that are doing a great job.
Yeah.
Right. So they're like, look at me, look at my numbers. Right. And then, a little competition doesn't hurt anybody. So it's starting to drive a little bit of a different change across the board.
But I feel like we've come to a point where now we can enact some policy. So you're doing this. And so one of the things that we do in my organization, for all of our external recruiters that we, contract with and are out there trying to, find us all of these amazing lawyers to lateral over into our law firm, you are required, some on a monthly basis, and depending upon, of course, on our agreement we have with them, some on a quarterly basis. I come in on the meeting with the folks on the hiring side through talent acquisition, and we open up my diversity dashboard. Let me show you what our diversity demographics are for our Miami office. So I want you to see, what my current talent looks like. So now you can infuse some intentionality in what you're doing from a recruiting standpoint. And then I want you to check back in. So now that you understand kind of what my landscape is, you go forth and prosper and you starting to bring your candidates to me. But I want to give them that same scorecard because people pay recruiters a lot of money. And so now I want to put you on that scorecard the same way you do your CEOs. And I want to say, how is it that you have not given me at least one, potential woman who can lateral over into this firm in 90 days? Right. You couldn't find one, that's ridiculous, again, in the United States of America. So I think that very much so, maybe that's not a quote policy that we're writing down, but it certainly can be a practice where, or it is, if you embed it within the contract, you must do a check-in with someone from D&I who's going to be in on those meetings, who's going to talk to you about what our diversity demographics are, again, by firm, by office or by position, et cetera, depending upon what they're recruiting for.
And there's one more piece I'd just say, I'm sorry, I cut you off there a little bit, Lloyd, sorry. Is that, one statistic I heard some years ago when I was doing a lot of recruiting at Johnson & Johnson was you need 3 to 1. So you need to have 3 diverse people versus to 1 white person on the slate in order for the hiring manager to increase the opportunity of them hiring a diverse candidate.
Oh.
And that blew my mind, right? So that's how, that is how imperative it is to make sure your slate is diverse.
So I want to make sure that we kind of give some folks some ideas, because as they go back to their respective organizations and are thinking about ways in which they can enact some D&I policy, let's give them some of the must-haves. Talk to them about some of the things that they should maybe audit, to Timothy's point, within their existing policies. And so we'll do a little round robin here. I'll bring up certain topics, issues that, of course, every organization faces, and maybe we can kind of give some quick bullets around things you should look at as to ways in which you can maybe refresh. Timothy, let me start with you around required training and education. What should folks be looking at to have embedded within their organization's policies as it relates to their training or their education?
Sure. I think it's a critical component to tie. If you have a sort of OD team, a learning and development team, that you're thoughtful about what the training needs are broadly, what the business cases are broadly. And I'm going back to this inclusive yet differentiated. So broadly speaking, here are the training and education needs, and then finding ways, number one, to merge DEI into some of those training needs. So for example, I'm currently in our organization really working with our partners across the organization to ask the question. So here are the annual trainings that you do. What is the diversity, equity, and inclusion lens in this particular training, right? So, so really refining and thinking critically about what's already in our universe, but then asking the question, okay, so what are the training needs that are specifically diversity focused that we can embellish and add or refine, and quite frankly, onboard where necessary. So the training and workshop, I love to do it from a data-driven perspective. So one of the first conversations that I have in any organization is to ask the leadership, okay, so what are the things that keep you up at night from a diversity perspective? Right? And then being able to build out a catalog of DEI training and learning that focuses specifically on those things, while also, of course, as a DEI officer, really focusing on things that I know to be true and important.
Oh, yeah.
But when you do it in that way, you're getting the buy-in of leadership who says, okay, I don't know enough about unconscious bias, or I am not really shored up with respect to the importance of multilingual work environments. And so how can I, as a DEI officer, both meet the needs of what I believe to be their appetite, while also, and what my mother would do to me, right? When I was 3, I didn't like broccoli, right? But so my mom cooked broccoli. And so what she would do was she would often put chocolate on the broccoli until I developed an appetite for the broccoli itself. And so how might we do that, right? How might we use that model to ensure that there are some things that there may not be an appetite for? So we sweeten it a little bit until we gradually diminish the kind of sweetener that is needed until there's an organizational appetite, until they're calling you, asking you for it. Yes. Doing that, I think, has been a really great way for me to be successful in organizations.
Love that. Love that. Well, and it's also a way to really keep you and your team accountable as well. You know, if you know that we're going to do either an annual survey to find out, you know, what is it that folks want, and or we already have, you know, this kind of existing policy or time on the calendar. You know, every May there's going to be a D&I focused program. You know, you're going to have everyone's attention for 90 minutes. Again, you know, that means you've got to stay abreast of what are the happenings and what are the new trends in the D&I space. Gina, I'm bringing up another issue for you, parental leave. What should folks be looking at when they're kind of examining or re-examining their parental leave, and what should those policies look like?
Before I get to that, I need to speak to Timothy and how he could eat chocolate on broccoli.
Listen.
I completely finished. This panel is over as far as I'm concerned. I can't.
What he left out is that his mother also like seat belted him into that high chair so he couldn't move. So he was going to eat it regardless.
That was traumatizing. Thank you, Timothy, for that. So maybe for parental leave, we need to talk about parents and chocolate. No.
And chocolate, right.
So I think for parental leave, I think the key here is to remember that the parents, everyone are parents, right? Whether it's the mother or the father, a partner, it doesn't matter. And I think a lot of times, you know, policies as it relates to parental leave tend to really, you know, almost think about the mother only, right? Mm-hmm. And we have to think about a lot of times with the father or same-sex marriages and parenting, that we've got to cover this across the board and you know, make sure that we give that time to everyone. And then also looking at all the different ways that someone can become a parent. And I
Yes.
think that is really where there's still a gap. I think there's been a lot of great work that has gone into making it gender inclusive a little bit, you know, obviously giving a different timing, but at least including the fathers in the mix. But where I think there's a gap is where it's if the children are born naturally, if they're adopted, if they're surrogate, if it's, you know, pick a different thing, or if it's I'm taking on family because I have a family member that cannot handle their children, right? And the fact that that's not included in a parental leave program just shows the systemic breakdown that we have, right? Because we know that, you know, that may come up a lot more frequently with those that come from low income families, right? And so the socioeconomic impact of that and not being able to take the time can make a real toll on someone's job and their stress level and what they're able to do, and are they going to be able to finish the work? And I think that's where there's got to be a shift in this parental leave space, is to encompass all of the different ways that someone may become a parent, right? I may take on my cousin's children, not because I'm truly dying to be a parent, but because I don't want these kids to end up in the system.
Right.
And I think that's not included. And I think that's something that more people need to work on.
And that's on the one hand, you know, if you've already got those individuals working within your organization, don't forget there are, you know, prospective employees, you know, who are asking these tough questions. These are a part of interviews now, you know, where they're asking, what does that leave policy look like? You know, again, they know that there's a war on talent, you know, and so they're trying to make sure that they can find, you know, the environment that's going to really speak to them and give them a space. And so to the extent that you do not, have not gone through and looked at your parental leave policies, you better do it, particularly if you still want to attract the best talent, because the person down the street, they're looking at it and they're making sure that they speak to these individuals. Timothy, flex time, hybrid working conditions. I feel like, you know, we've talked about this ad nauseum by this point in time, but what should people be looking at in that particular policy?
So similarly, I agree that if we're going to attract the best and the brightest, you know, as the world becomes increasingly globalized, it's critical that we recognize that that is a strategic lever for competitive talent. I have been in organizations where people have said to me, listen, I love the organization. I love what it stands for. I would love to be here, but you all don't have flex time. You don't have a hybrid work environment. So I'm going to go over to an organization that I feel less passionate and compassionate about, and recognize that maybe it's not as culturally congruent as this organization for me because of this particular factor. And so, you know, as we become a more millennial heavy work environment, I believe by 2025, 70 to 75% of folks who are working will be identified as millennials. So we got to be mindful of some of the cultural expectations. And, you know, what was germane to organizations around policies 50 years ago was keeping up with the times. And so I would argue that if we're going to keep up with the times, then we ought to be really mindful that a flexible work environment really, especially in today's environment, make sure that we have mitigated any levels of inflexibility for other folks. So going back to Gina and Lloyd's comments around, there are parents, right, who need a flexible work environment as they drop their kids off, or as they pick their children up, or individuals who may have other needs that are really germane to their specific identities, or visible or invisible disabilities. And by virtue of that, they can do just as good work. They just need some flex time. So are we willing to trust our employees enough to say that we're not going to micromanage you in the way that maybe we culturally have become accustomed to? We're going to trust and embolden you with all the requisite tools you'll need to be successful, while giving you the canvas to paint on, even though it looks a little non-traditional. So I would just argue that this is a must-have policy, specifically as we become far more globalized societally.
Yes. I want to make sure that we get to this comment in the chat before we wrap up. And it was around exit interviews and the questions that are currently being asked or maybe not being asked. And by way of what policy or what best practices you would infuse. As I let the panelists think about that, I wanted to take a stab first. certainly within our law firm, number one, the best practice is that someone from D&I is a part of that exit interview process. And so whether or not, I actually sit in on the exit interview is one thing, but I'm at least going to get that information. That's going to still be reported back to me, because we cannot find out what we could have done better, what we could have done to keep this individual where they're going, and how we match up to them by way of our policies, practices, et cetera, if I don't get that information. Again, the data. So the folks who are over on the D&I side of the house have to have this data. And so I would think that number one, by way of policy, is involving some D&I professional within your exit interviews. Gina, Timothy, what would you two add to that?
I think one of the things is, making sure you understand. I think a lot of times people instantly think folks are leaving because they're getting paid more from some other place, or they're getting a promotion or something like that. And I think staying away from focusing in on that, but focusing in on why was this X company able to come to you and bring you there? So what is it about the culture? Was it the manager? How was your manager relationship? How was your team dynamic? How did you feel? Did you feel like you belonged? Did you feel like you were really a part of this group? One of the things that I often say to people is you can do the exit interview like as soon as they're walking out the door. But if anyone's like me, that is when you're going to be like, I don't really care either way, right? And I'm out the door. I argue that the real exit interview is when you go to them 2 or 3 months later after they leave, and say to them, hey, just reaching out, I know you were here. How's it going in your new role? Tell me a little bit more about what made you leave, or what's the differences? How are you feeling? Because a lot of times by then they've either figured out that they love the place that they're at, or they figured out, what have I done? Right? And they're like, actually, y'all weren't all that bad. And I think a lot of times we focus in on them as soon as they're leaving, when they're already either 1, angry, 2, checked out, or 3, excited about where they're going. I think it's better to have a conversation a little bit later.
Love it. We could go on, for time infinitum, kind of talking about these potential policies, but I want to make sure that we're respectful of everyone's time with the conference. Gina, Timothy, thank you so much for the insight. Hopefully our attendees learned a bit about policies, ways in which you can enact policies, some of the areas in which you should start looking to refresh your policies. We do thank you so much for the ACC for extending the invitation. Hopefully I put into the chat that everyone will connect with us so we can keep the conversation going. Again, I put my podcast link in there. Let's continue to do this. This is not about us being competitors in this space. This is really an issue for talent generally, and humans even more generally and broadly. So let's make sure that we kind of all work together to make our spaces more equitable and more inclusive. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
So I know we hate this, but at this point, we must conclude this session. On behalf of our chapter, I'd like to extend a special thanks to our sponsor, Buchanan, Ingersoll, and Rooney, and to our panelists, Lloyd Freeman, Dr. Timothy Fair, and Gina Pemberton. And thanks, Lloyd, for including the additional resources in the chat group. We will be taking another break. However, if you have a question and would like to speak to the panel directly, feel free to remain here and take yourself off mute to address the panelists. Thank you.
So welcome back from the break. My name is Tamika Warner, and I'm Senior Director and Deputy General Counsel at Fannie Mae and co-chair of the ACC NCR DEI Programming Subcommittee. How was that for a mouthful? I recently had the opportunity to sit down with ACC Foundation's Program Director, KJ Forrest, to discuss 2 tools that might be a valuable resource for you as you work with your company to move the DEI needle. One was the results of 2 ACC NCR diversity surveys, which our chapter circulated last year. And the other, the DEI maturity model, developed by ACC Global and the ACC Foundation, which you can use to measure DEI maturity at your company. We're pleased to spotlight these tools in the following video. Last summer, ACC NCR asked its chapter members for input for our first ever diversity, equity, and inclusion survey. We collected information about specific DEI initiatives at our member companies. The survey sought qualitative data about practices of companies and legal departments and that impact inclusiveness, belonging, and culture, and the perceptions about those efforts. Our aim was to identify successful initiatives and those that may not be getting the desired outcomes. We decided to create 2 surveys. The individual corporate counsel survey was to gauge how aware members were of the various DEI initiatives that were undertaken in their workplace and how they perceived the initiative's effectiveness. We created a separate survey for chief legal officers because we figured they would be aware of the steps that were taken and wanted to gauge effectiveness from their perspective as well. So first, let me say we did not set out to do a scientific survey. This was a pulse survey, and a pulse survey is a tool that any company, department, or team can use to do a quick check-in, to get feedback on what they're doing and how they can change course in order to get desired results. So between the 2 surveys, we had over 100 respondents, and the results did have some surprises for us. And I'll share 2 of those with you. We asked about approximately 18 commonly discussed DEI initiatives. These included about trainings, communication efforts, having dedicated personnel, engagements with outside counsel, talent development, and DEI is a factor in performance reviews and compensation. And I'll say that for all but 3 of these initiatives, most of our members responded that they were not even aware of these initiatives happening in their workplace, or that they didn't exist, that they were not happening. Looking at the CLO survey, the Chief Legal Officer survey, there was some support for the fact that some of these initiatives were in fact not happening or not happening yet. But the results did indicate that there was a real delta between initiatives that were undertaken and the awareness that employees had about them. So for one, there's a real opportunity to increase awareness at what our companies are doing to move this needle forward, which is the topic of this conference. For leaders, it's to communicate the initiatives that are actually being undertaken. And for members, it's to investigate. We have a duty to ask about what is happening and for all of us to participate in this collective effort. A second interesting finding was around communications. And actually members responded that communications around diversity, equity, and inclusion were both among the most effective and the least effective of initiatives. So that was quite an interesting finding. Now, the Pulse survey was not detailed enough to tell us why. We need deeper analysis, but it did make us curious. There are internal communications, there are diversity pledges, and other public communications. And we saw a great number of those, particularly in the year before our survey and since then. But we've also seen some concerns that some of these communications may be more performative than impactful. So I guess the takeaway may be that communications are vitally necessary, but they're not sufficient in and of themselves. And again, that's the theme of this conference, right? How to move this needle forward, because a lot of work that's being done is necessary, but impact is the aim. So those were only 2 findings from the survey. The full survey results are available in our DEI newsletter, and we'll include them as resources for this conference. But with one tool, that Pulse survey being one tool, KJ, can you share with us this tool that the ACC Foundation has developed?
Absolutely. And if you'll give me a moment, I'm going to share my screen. It's no secret that the legal profession has struggled to make meaningful gains when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. In 2021, the American Bar Association's National Lawyer Population Survey showed that lawyers of color represented 11.5% of the legal profession. Today, it's roughly 14.6%, an increase of less than 3 percentage points over the past decade. And it's important to note that this only accounts for people of color. It doesn't address the DEI challenges faced by other diverse groups, such as the LGBTQ plus attorneys, attorneys with disabilities, or women, particularly those that have left the legal field and start to focus on families and find returning to be an uphill battle. Furthermore, while some departments are diverse, when you look up and down the org chart or at compensation, they may not be equitable. Or if you ask diverse attorneys about the culture of their experience in the organization or the legal department, even the lucky ones that experience some sense of reasonable equity may not have found a sense of inclusion. I said all that to say, despite the slower than desired progress, there are numerous organizations and individuals that are dedicated to improving DEI across the legal and in-house communities. And the ACC and the ACC Foundation wanted to provide them with tools to that end. So to assist in that effort, the ACC Foundation worked with an advisory committee of top corporate executives with DEI expertise to develop and launch the ACC Foundation Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Maturity Model. The maturity model serves as a simple and pragmatic resource that numerous department and organizational leaders can use to measure where their DEI programs and policies are currently and to help identify clear next steps where improvements are necessary. So the DEI maturity model development process began with the ACC Foundation conducting interviews with 13 diverse general counsel, chief legal officers, and heads of legal. They provided unique perspectives on topics such as developing attorneys, creating useful programs, and advancing DEI internally and externally. And here are a few of the organizations that are represented. I'm sure some of them are very familiar to you, and we were happy to work with each and every one of them. So we then took their input and turned it over to a working group comprised of leading DEI experts. And they convened to identify 13 specific categories for each of the key defined factors, and then develop an early, intermediate, and advanced strategy and maturity level for each of these 13 categories. So to give you an idea of how the maturity models work, the maturity model works, first, we define the terms to ensure that we're all on the same page. Far too often, some of these terms are used interchangeably. Some departments are diverse, but not inclusive, if you catch my drift. So here's a list of the definitions that we included. Then we provided pathways for DEI success in each of the categories. And I want to walk you through a few examples. So one area that we focused on was governing and resourcing, which we define as the level at which the governing bodies of the organization prioritize creating a work structure around and devoting resources to DEI. And so here you'll see at the beginner level, while I won't walk you through every one, at the beginning level, this process is amorphous. They're informal guidelines and policies, but nothing that's established and nothing that's consistent. And so what the model seeks to do is to move folks who are in the early stage to the intermediate stage, where there's a basic governing model that's established, where committees among the leadership are instituted and funding is budgeted for resources and not just devoted in an ad hoc manner. And then we move to an advanced level where governance is representative of all people, regions, business units, and functions within the organization. There's a consistent information feedback loop of relevant parties, and the DEI legal team resources include all relevant skill sets, be it operations, administration, legal, IT, et cetera. We'll go through one more. Measurements, which we define as creating systems to track DEI goals. At the beginner level, the organization is seeking to get buy-in from leadership, identifying metrics, and then implementing a data collection plan of some sort, right? Still a bit amorphous there. And then to move to an intermediate level, The data that they've collected is now being collected by a data management system as opposed to a less structured method. And KPIs and performance targets are now in place. So we're not just holding the data, but we're using it to go somewhere, right? And then we move to an advanced level of maturity, where the organization now has the ability to track trends over time, and DEI is taken into consideration in performance evaluations and leadership compensation. So we're not just using the data to go somewhere, but directly to the destination that we've set, and we're improvising propulsion in that direction. And the model creates such pathways across all the 13 categories that we've identified. So it's important to note here that this is only the first version of the ACC Foundation's Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Maturity Model. Presently, it serves exclusively as a self-assessment tool. And as we put it into practice, we'll be seeking to incorporate useful feedback from people that are using the tool, and then also adding tangible, practical, written resources, tools, and takeaways to add some teeth and practicality to the model. One such tool is actually currently in development. The ACC Foundation is partnering with Ethisphere to produce a quantifiable data benchmarking tool that will allow organizations to enter the metrics that they've set for their organization and some of their areas of progress into an online module that will produce a report that will allow them to benchmark against other organizations around the world. And so that's coming out hopefully in summer of this year. So be on the lookout for that. One last thing that I'll say, as you use the model to develop new best practices, we'd love to incorporate them. So for additional information, if you have questions, interest in putting the model into practice, or want to share your own best practices, policies, and testimonials as you use the model, please contact us at foundation@acc.com, or you can contact me directly at k.forrest@acc.com.
Thank you, KJ, for that. I'm really excited, and I'm sure a number of our members are, about the benchmarking that might be available to folks to get that started, especially as we're trying to move forward in our data collection. And we know benchmarking is super important to companies. And so that should help us to move this forward as well. So thank you for that.
No, my pleasure.
So we hope that the ACC NCR survey results and the ACC and ACC Foundation's maturity model will be helpful resources for you. We've discussed so many important concepts today, and we now want to take a chance, give you the chance to hear from one another. We've created 9 breakout rooms on 5 topics, and in just a few minutes, we'll ask you to select a room to join. But first, let me explain what the different rooms will be discussing. You might want to note them down as I'm describing them. So rooms 1 and 2, the topic is lessons learned in implementing DEI initiatives. In this room, you'll be sharing ideas of things that have worked well in organizations, ideas of what might be effective to implement, or even ideas of what others should not attempt. Room 3 is where the organization is in the maturity model. This room will facilitate discussions on what companies could do to get to the next step, and how to best assess where your company is on that continuum, early, intermediate, and advanced. We'll only have 1 room on the maturity model, and KJ Forrest has agreed to stay with us and join this room. Rooms 4 and 5 will be on making the business case that DEI needs to be the priority. Sometimes company leadership doesn't believe DEI issues are a problem at the company, and this room will brainstorm some ideas on what you can do to affect company culture. What practical steps can you take to change the culture so it appreciates the importance and benefits of DEI initiatives? Rooms 6 and 7 will be on making change in the legal department. So even if there aren't initiatives at the enterprise level, how can you create something within your legal department? And this room will discuss what you can do within the department, even if your company has limited resources. In rooms 8 and 9, the discussion will be on consequences of having DEI conversations. Sometimes there's discomfort for people in discussing DEI issues. Fear came up earlier today. Maybe you're concerned about saying the wrong thing, hearing things that could be triggering, or you're worried about internal or external repercussions, this room is to help discuss some consequences and strategies on how to move the needle forward in spite of those. So I'm sure each room will have very interesting discussions. You'll have about 35 minutes in the breakout, right? So wow, thank you all so much. You did have some great conversations, and I imagine that time went by really quickly and we all could have talked for more than 35 minutes. Our objective with today's conference was to discuss why the needle hasn't moved in this area as much as we would have hoped, and then to offer some resources and tools, share information that we can implement to push that needle along. I believe we've met that objective, and I hope that each of you have learned something that you can immediately apply to impact the DEI culture in your department and at your company. Thank you so much to all our speakers today, to Paula Edgar for her keynote, and to our sponsors, Ogletree Deacons and Buchanan, Ingersoll and Rooney. Thank you to Lauren Hicks, Lloyd Freeman, KJ Forrest, Aisha Massengill, Paul Kehoe, Dr. Timothy Fair, and Gina Pemberton for sharing their wisdom and insights on our panels. I'd also like to thank Shannon Graving and the ACC NCR staff who helped with the planning logistics for this conference, with a special call out to Kasha Hunt for her tireless work with the subcommittee and working behind the scenes to keep us on track so we can bring you a conference that I hope you agree was worthwhile. And so we're grateful for all your participation and hope to see you at another ACC NCR DEI event soon. In particular, we hope that you'll join us to meet the 2022 corporate scholars at the reception that's going to be held in their honor on Tuesday, June 7th from 5:30 to 7:30. And you can see the chat for that registration link. And so with that, thank you all, everyone, and have a wonderful weekend.